The museum at night removes distraction. Without movement, conversation, and the pressure of time, objects are no longer encountered as part of a sequence, but as systems. What appears stable in daylight begins to reveal its construction. This is particularly true for the human figure in ancient Greek art, which is often described as natural, balanced, or ideal. Yet none of these qualities are inherent. They are produced. The sculptures that define this period do not represent the body as it exists. They construct a body according to principles that are not immediately visible. These principles are neither purely observational nor purely symbolic. They operate between perception and abstraction, translating the variability of the human form into a system of relations that can be measured, repeated, and stabilized. The result is not an individual body, but a model. This distinction is essential. A model does not describe a specific instance. It defines a structure that can generate multiple instances while maintaining coherence. In this sense, Greek sculpture does not aim to capture reality. It aims to produce a version of reality that appears self-evident. The success of this production lies in its invisibility. The more constructed the form, the more natural it appears. The development of this model depends on a shift in how the body is understood. Earlier representation do not attempt to resolve the body into a unified system. They rely on conventions that organize the figure symbolically rather than anatomically. What emerges in the classical period is not simply greater accuracy, but a different problem. The body becomes something that must be internally consistent. Every part must relate to every other part according to a set of rules that extend across the entire figure. These rules are often described in terms of proportion, but proportion alone does not explain their effect. What matters is the relationship between proportion and perception. The body is not constructed to satisfy measurement in isolation, but to produce a specific visual experience. Stability, balance, and clarity are not abstract ideals. They are perceptual outcomes. The figure must appear resolved from multiple viewpoints, maintaining coherence even as the viewer moves. This introduces a second level of construction. The body is not only organized internally, it is positioned in relation to the viewer. The stance, the distribution of weight, and the orientation of the head all participate in a controlled presentation. Movement is implied, but never completed. The figure exists in a state that suggests potential without requiring action. This condition allows the form to remain stable while still appearing alive. At the same time, expression is minimized. The face does not communicate individual emotion. It does not function as a site of psychological depth. Instead, it maintains a level of neutrality that reinforces the generality of the figure. This neutrality is not an absence, it is a decision. By removing specific emotional content, the figure avoids particularity and moves toward universality. The result is a form that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is anatomical without being descriptive. It is ideal without being abstract. It is stable without being static. These tensions are not contradictions. They are the conditions that allow the figure to function as a standard. A standard must be consistent, but it must also be adaptable. It must define limits, while allowing variation within those limits. This standard does not remain confined to sculpture. It extends into architecture, where similar principles organize space through proportion and alignment. It reappears in later periods, particularly in the Renaissance, where it is studied, reconstructed, and reinterpreted. The persistence of these forms is not accidental. It reflects the durability of the system that produced them. To understand this system, it is necessary to move away from the assumption that Greek art is simply about beauty. Beauty, in this context, is not a starting point. It is an effect. It emerges from the interaction of structure, proportion, and perception. What appears harmonious is the result of constraints that have been carefully calibrated. This also means that what is excluded is as important as what is included. Variability is reduced. Irregularity is controlled. Elements that cannot be integrated into the system are omitted. The body that remains is not more real. It is more consistent. As you move through this space, the repetition of similar forms does not indicate a lack of invention. It indicates the presence of a shared framework. Each figure is a variation within a defined system. The differences between them do not disrupt the structure. They confirm it. The question, then, is not how accurately these works represent the body, but how effectively they construct a version of the body that can function as a reference. A reference does not simply describe, it organizes perception, it establishes expectations, it defines what is considered correct. This definition has consequences that extend beyond the objects themselves. Once the body is understood through this system, it becomes difficult to see it otherwise. The model begins to shape perception, not only within art, but in broader cultural contexts. The ideal becomes a lens. The figures in this gallery do not assert this position explicitly. They do not argue for their authority. They simply maintain it through consistency. Their presence is stable because the system that supports them is stable. To examine these works, then, is not only to look at objects, but to engage with a framework that continues to influence how form is understood. The task is not to recover an original meaning, but to identify the structures that make these forms appear natural. What appears immediate is constructed. What appears universal is specific. What appears inevitable is the result of decisions that can be traced, analyzed, and understood. The stillness of the museum makes this analysis possible. Without interruption, the relationships between forms become clearer. The system does not change, but its visibility increases. What follows is not a history of objects, but an examination of how a particular conception of the human body was produced, stabilized, and maintained. A conception that continues to operate, often without recognition, shaping the way the body is seen, measured, and evaluated. The figures remain silent. The structure does not announce itself, but it is present, and it can be read. The earliest Greek constructions of the human figure do not originate in empirical observation of the body as a variable, contingent entity. They emerge from a system of formal organization that precedes perception and governs it. The archaic figure is not a record of what the body looks like under particular conditions. It is the outcome of a structured approach to representation in which clarity, stability, and legibility take priority over variability. The body is not discovered through looking, it is produced through rules. This distinction aligns with the broader theoretical understanding of representation articulated by Ernst Gombrich, who argued that depiction does not begin with the direct transcription of visual reality, but with schemata that organize perception into recognizable forms. In this sense, the kouros and core figures are not primitive approximations of a later realism. They are highly coherent instantiations of a schema that defines what counts as a body within a given system of representation. The kouros figure exemplifies this schema with particular clarity. The body is arranged frontally, with the vertical axis of the figure aligned to a central plane that divides it symmetrically. This axiality ensures that the figure can be comprehended immediately, without requiring the viewer to navigate around it. The stance, with one foot advanced, but without a corresponding shift in weight, introduces a minimal differentiation while preserving the dominance of symmetry. The arms remain attached to the sides, the hands closed, the shoulders level. Each element contributes to the maintenance of a stable configuration. This stability is not simply visual, it is conceptual. The body is understood as an arrangement of the parts that can be ordered according to principles that are independent of any particular instance. The figure does not respond to gravity in a way that reflects lived experience. It does not distribute weight dynamically. Instead, it maintains an equilibrium that is achieved through bilateral correspondence. This correspondence is the primary organizing principle. The treatment of the surface reinforces this principle. Musculature is indicated, but it is not differentiated according to functional anatomy. The pectoral region is defined through a generalized convex form. The abdomen is segmented into a pattern that suggests structure, but does not correspond to the variability of actual muscle groups. The knees are articulated as discrete units, often emphasized through incised lines that mark their boundaries. These features do not emerge from a study of how the body operates. They are part of a visual vocabulary that identifies the figure as human within the constraints of the schema. The core figure introduces additional complexity through the use of drapery, but the underlying logic remains consistent. The body is concealed, yet its presence is implied through the regularity of the folds. Drapery is not treated as a response to movement or to the physical properties of fabric. It is organized into rhythmic patterns that mirror the symmetry of the body beneath. The garment becomes an extension of the system, reinforcing the stability of the figure rather than introducing variability. The face operates within the same framework. The so-called archaic smile doesn't function as an expression of emotion. It is a formal device that prevents the face from appearing inert while maintaining its generality. The slight curvature of the lips introduces a minimal deviation from strict neutrality, but it does not indicate a psychological state. The eyes are often wide and almond-shaped, the gaze fixed, the features arranged symmetrically. The face does not individuate the figure, it stabilizes it. The persistence of these features across multiple works indicates that they are not the result of individual decisions. They reflect a shared system that defines how the body should be represented. This system can be understood as a set of constraints that limit variability in order to produce consistency. The figure is legible because it conforms to these constraints. The influence of earlier traditions, particularly Egyptian art, is evident in the reliance on frontal orientation and axial symmetry. However, the Greek adaptation of these elements involves a recontextualization. In Egyptian art, the organization of the body is closely tied to its function within a symbolic and ritual framework. The figure is constructed to ensure its participation in a larger order that is both visual and metaphysical. In the Greek context, while the emphasis on order remains, the function of the figure begins to shift toward an investigation of form itself. This shift can be analyzed through the concept of mimesis as it is later articulated by Aristotle. Mimesis is not a passive copying of appearances. It is an active process of selecting and organizing elements to produce a coherent representation. The archaic figure does not imitate the body as it appears under specific conditions. It constructs a version of the body that conforms to a set of principles that make it intelligible within the system. The intelligibility of the figure depends on its resistance to variation. The body must appear the same, regardless of the conditions of viewing. This requirement leads to the suppression of elements that would introduce instability. Movement is minimized. Asymmetry is avoided. Expression is controlled. The figure is not allowed to change. This resistance to change can be understood in relation to the concept of ideal types, as discussed in later theoretical frameworks. An ideal type is not an average of observed instances. It is a constructed model that emphasizes certain features while excluding others in order to produce a consistent reference. The archaic figure functions in this way. It is not derived from a statistical analysis of bodies. It is constructed to embody a set of qualities that define what a body should be within the system. The emphasis on symmetry plays a central role in this construction. Symmetry ensures that the figure can be divided into corresponding parts that mirror each other. This mirroring reinforces the stability of the form and simplifies its comprehension. However, symmetry also imposes limitations. It prevents the figure from accommodating the asymmetrias that characterize the body in motion or even at rest. The archaic system prioritizes clarity over complexity. This prioritization is not arbitrary. It reflects a specific approach to representation in which the goal is to produce forms that can be recognized and repeated. The figure must be reproducible. It must maintain its identity across different instances. The system achieves this by reducing the number of variables that can change. At the same time, the system is not entirely rigid. Within the constraints of symmetry and frontal orientation, there are controlled variations. The advancement of 1 foot in the kouros introduces a minimal differentiation along the horizontal axis. The treatment of hair, often rendered in stylized strands or patterned curls, introduces surface complexity. The drapery of the core creates rhythmic variations that contrast with the underlying stability of the body. These elements do not disrupt the system. They operate within it. The presence of variation within constraint is significant. It demonstrates that the system is not purely mechanical. It allows for adjustments, but these adjustments are regulated. They do not extend to the fundamental organization of the body. The system remains dominant. The limitations of the archaic system become apparent when the body is considered in relation to space. The figure stands, but it does not engage with its surroundings in a dynamic way. The relationship between the body and space is minimal. The figure occupies space, but it does not respond to it. This limitation becomes increasingly evident as sculptors begin to consider how the body interacts with its environment. The transition toward a more integrated conception of the body involves a redefinition of balance. In the archaic figure, balance is achieved through symmetry. Both sides of the body are equivalent. However, this equivalence does not reflect how the body maintains balance in practice. To represent the body more convincingly, balance must be understood as a dynamic condition that involves the distribution of weight across different parts. This redefinition leads to the introduction of asymmetry. One leg may bear more weight than the other. The hips may tilt. The shoulders may respond to this tilt. These adjustments require a system that can accommodate relational differences between parts. The body is no longer organized solely through correspondence. It is organized through interaction. The development of such a system is associated with the classical period and with figures such as Polykleitos, whose canon attempts to define the body through a set of proportional relationships. However, the emergence of this approach depends on the recognition of the limitations of the archaic system. The inability of symmetry to account for the dynamics of the body necessitates a new framework. This new framework does not abandon the emphasis on order. It transforms it. Order is no longer achieved through the repetition of identical parts. It is achieved through the coordination of different parts that relate to each other according to specific ratios. The body becomes a system of relations. The theoretical implications of this shift can be understood through the work of Erwin Panofsky, particularly in his analysis of perspective as a symbolic form. Although Panofsky's primary focus is on later developments, his argument that systems of representation reflect underlying structures of thought can be applied here. The transition from archaic to classical representation involves a changes in how the body is conceptualized. It is no longer a collection of aligned elements. It is a coherent system in which each part is defined in relation to the whole. The role of perception in this process is central. The body is not constructed to satisfy measurement alone. It is constructed to produce a specific visual experience. The figure must appear stable, balanced, and coherent from multiple viewpoints. This requirement introduces a new level of complexity. The system must account not only for the internal organization of the body, but also for how it is perceived. This concern with perception is further developed in later analyses of visual culture, such as those by Michael Baxendale, who emphasize the historical specificity of visual skills and expectations. While Baxendale's work focuses on the Renaissance, the underlying principle that perception is shaped by cultural frameworks is relevant here. The Archaic system defines what can be seen as a body. It establishes a set of expectations that guide perception. The transition to a more integrated system involves a modification of these expectations. The viewer is no longer presented with a body that is immediately legible through symmetry alone. The viewer must engage with the figure, recognizing how different parts relate to each other. The experience of looking becomes more complex. At the same time, the conceptual status of the body changes. In the Archaic period, the body functions primarily as a sign within a system of representation. As the transition progresses, the body becomes an object of inquiry. It is analyzed in terms of its structure, its proportions, its capacity for movement. This analysis is not purely empirical. It is guided by the desire to construct a model that can define the ideal. The notion of the ideal does not emerge fully formed. It develops through the refinement of the system. The Archaic figure establishes the conditions under which the ideal can be conceived by defining the body as something that can be organized according to principles. The Classical period will build on this foundation, introducing a more complex system that integrates observation and proportion. The persistence of the Archaic figures within this broader trajectory is significant. They are not simply replaced by more advanced forms. They continue to function as references that define the starting point of the system. Their stability, their clarity, and their resistance to variation provide the basis upon which later developments can be understood. To analyze the Archaic body, then, is not to identify its shortcomings in relation to later standards. It is to recognize the coherence of the system it represents. This system prioritizes legibility over variability, stability over movement, and consistency over integration. These priorities define the body before perfection. The concept of perfection, as it will later be articulated, depends on the ability to integrate the parts of the body into a unified system that can accommodate complexity without losing coherence. The Archaic system does not yet achieve this integration, but it establishes the framework within which it becomes possible. The body before perfection is therefore not an incomplete version of a later ideal. It is a distinct construction that defines the problem to which the ideal will respond. It demonstrates that the body can be organized, that it can be stabilized, that it can function as a reference. It also reveals the limitations of this approach, creating the conditions for transformation. As you move through the gallery, the repetition of these forms becomes an index of the system. Each figure confirms the rules that govern it. Each variation reveals the boundaries within which those rules operate. The consistency across works is not a sign of uniformity. It is evidence of structure. The figures do not change, but the understanding of them does. What initially appears as simplicity reveals itself as a controlled reduction. What appears as rigidity reveals itself as a form of stability. What appears as absence reveals itself as a decision. The body before perfection is not defined by what it lacks. It is defined by how it is constructed. The transition from the Archaic construction of the body to what later becomes recognized as the classical form does not consist in a gradual increase in realism, nor in a simple refinement of technique, but in a fundamental reorganization of how the body is conceptualized as a system. The Archaic figure, as established previously, is governed by alignment, symmetry, and legibility, which together produce a stable but non-integrated structure in which each part is clearly defined, yet insufficiently related to the others. What emerges in the early classical period is not the abandonment of order, but the transformation of order from a principle of correspondence into a principle of relation. The body is no longer treated as a set of aligned components arranged along a central axis, but as an internally coordinated structure in which each part responds to changes in another, creating a network of interdependence that must be resolved into a coherent whole. This shift corresponds to broader developments in Greek intellectual culture, where explanation increasingly depends on identifying underlying principles that account for observable phenomena, and where the visible surface is no longer sufficient as a basis for understanding form. The body, in this context, becomes not merely an object of representation, but a problem that requires systematic resolution. This problem is most clearly articulated through the question of balance, which in the archaic system is achieved through symmetry, but in practice fails to account for how the body maintains equilibrium. Symmetry ensures visual clarity, but it does not reflect the distribution of weight in a standing figure, nor does it accommodate the adjustments required to sustain posture over time. The early classical response to this limitation is not to discard symmetry entirely, but to introduce asymmetry as a controlled condition, thereby redefining balance as a dynamic relation rather than a static equivalence. The figure now stands, with one leg bearing the weight, while the other remains relaxed, a condition that produces a cascade of compensatory adjustments throughout the body, including the tilting of the pelvis, the curvature of the spine, and the counter-alignment of the shoulders. These adjustments are not decorative or incidental. They establish the principle that no part of the body exists in isolation, and that the position of each element must be determined in relation to the whole. The body thus becomes a system of coordinated tensions and relaxations, in which stability is achieved not through sameness, but through the precise calibration of difference. The significance of this transformation extends beyond the representation of posture, because it introduces a new understanding of form as something that must be internally consistent across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The figure must not only stand, but stand convincingly, and this conviction depends on the integration of structural, anatomical, and perceptual factors into a single system. Musculature, for instance, is no longer treated as a generalized pattern applied to the surface of the body, but as a differentiated set of forms that respond to the distribution of weight and the implied potential for movement. Muscles that bear tension are rendered differently from those that are relaxed, and the transitions between them are smoothed to produce continuity rather than segmentation. This approach does not result in a purely descriptive anatomy, because the goal is not to replicate the body as it appears under specific conditions, but to construct a version of the body that appears coherent under all conditions. The anatomical detail is therefore selective, emphasizing those aspects that contribute to the overall system while omitting those that would introduce unnecessary complexity or disrupt visual clarity. The role of observation within this process must be understood carefully, because it does not function as a direct source of representation, but as a means of identifying patterns that can be abstracted and incorporated into a structured model. Observation provides information about how the body behaves, how it distributes weight, how it moves, and how its parts relate under different conditions, but this information is not transferred directly into the final form. Instead, it is filtered through a process of selection that prioritizes consistency over variability, resulting in a body that appears natural without being contingent. This distinction aligns with the theoretical position articulated by Ernst Gombrich, who emphasizes that representation operates through schemata that organize perception rather than through the direct imitation of visual reality. The classical body is therefore not an empirical record, but a constructed model that uses observation as a resource rather than as a constraint, allowing the artist to produce a form that is both believable and controlled. The introduction of relational thinking into the construction of the body also necessitates a reconsideration of proportion, which in the archaic system functions primarily as a means of maintaining symmetry, but in the classical system becomes a mechanism for integrating the parts into a unified whole. Proportion is no longer limited to ensuring that corresponding elements match each other across an axis. It now involves establishing ratios that determine how different parts of the body relate to each other in scale and position, creating a framework in which the entire figure can be understood as a coherent system of measurements. This development is most explicitly associated with polykleitos, whose canon proposes that the body can be defined through a set of numerical relationships that govern its structure. However, the importance of the canon lies not in its specific ratios, which are not preserved in a definitive form, but in the conceptual shift it represents, namely the idea that the body can be generated through a system of relations, rather than assembled from discrete parts. The figure becomes an expression of proportion, rather than an arrangement of components, and this transformation fundamentally alters how form is understood. The implications of this shift extend into the domain of perception, because the body must now be constructed in such a way that its internal coherence is visible to the viewer. The figure must appear stable, balanced, and integrated from multiple viewpoints, which requires that the relationships between its parts be maintained even as the viewer moves around it. This condition introduces a level of complexity that is absent from the archaic system, where the frontal orientation ensures immediate legibility, but limits the figure's engagement with space. In the classical system, the body invites movement, not because it is depicted in action, but because its structure unfolds gradually as the viewer changes position. The relationships between parts are not all visible at once. They must be discovered through the act of looking, which transforms the viewing experience from passive recognition into active interpretation. This transformation can be understood in relation to the theoretical framework proposed by Erwin Panofsky, who argues that systems of representation reflect underlying cognitive structures that shape how visual information is organized and interpreted. The classical body embodies a relational mode of thinking, in which meaning is derived from the interaction of parts rather than from their isolated presence. The treatment of the face within this system reflects a similar balance between specificity and generality, as the rigid and formulaic expressions of the archaic period give way to a more neutral and controlled presentation that avoids both extreme emotion and complete abstraction. The face is modeled with greater subtlety, allowing for smoother transitions between features and a more convincing representation of volume, but it does not become a site of individuality or psychological depth. The absence of strong emotional expression is not a limitation. It is a structural necessity, because the figure is intended to function as a general model rather than as a specific individual. Emotion would introduce variability that could not be easily integrated into the system, whereas neutrality allows the face to maintain its coherence across different instances. This approach aligns with the broader aim of constructing a type rather than a portrait, where the type is defined by its structural properties rather than by its personal characteristics. The concept of the type can be further clarified through its relationship to philosophical notions of universality, particularly those associated with Plato, who distinguishes between particular instances and ideal forms that exist independently of them. While classical sculpture does not directly implement Platonic theory, it operates within a similar conceptual space, where the visible body is understood as an approximation of a more perfect abstract structure that cannot be fully realized, but can be approached through systematic construction. The figure is therefore not an end in itself, but a means of articulating a set of principles that define what the body should be. This orientation toward the ideal does not eliminate the role of observation. It redefines it as a tool for identifying the elements that can be incorporated into a coherent system. The integration of the body into a relational system also affects its interaction with space, as the figure is no longer conceived as an isolated object, but as a form that occupies and responds to its environment. The distribution of weight, the orientation of the limbs, and the direction of the gaze all contribute to how the figure engages with the surrounding space, creating a more dynamic relationship between object and environment. This development anticipates later architectural principles, where space is organized according to similar relational structures, and where the experience of movement becomes a central component of design. The body, in this sense, becomes a model for organizing not only form, but also spatial experience, extending its influence beyond sculpture into broader domains of visual culture. The discovery of the human form, then, must be understood not as a moment of revelation, but as a process of construction that involves the reorganization of existing principles into a more complex and integrated system. The body is not found in nature as a ready-made ideal. It is produced through the interaction of observation, proportion, and perception, resulting in a form that appears natural, precisely because it has been carefully constructed to conceal the mechanisms of its own production. The success of this system lies in its invisibility, as the viewer encounters the figure as self-evident, rather than as the outcome of a deliberate process. This invisibility has significant consequences because it allows the constructed model to function as a standard that shapes perception beyond the immediate context of the artwork. Once the body is understood through the system, it becomes difficult to see it otherwise, as the relationships that define the figure begin to inform how bodies are perceived in general. The classical body thus establishes a framework that extends into later periods, influencing not only artistic representation, but also broader cultural conceptions of the human form. Its authority derives not from explicit assertion, but from the consistency and coherence of the system that produces it. As one moves through the gallery, the figures no longer appear as isolated works, but as variations within a shared structure, each demonstrating the operation of the system in slightly different configurations. The differences between them do not disrupt the underlying principles. They confirm the flexibility of the system, showing that it can accommodate variation without losing coherence. The body has been transformed from a static arrangement into a dynamic structure, capable of sustaining complexity while maintaining clarity. What has been discovered, therefore, is not the body as it exists in lived experience, but the body as it can be constructed within a system that prioritizes order, relation, and perception. This discovery does not conclude the development of Greek art. It establishes the conditions under which further refinement becomes possible, setting the stage for the formulation of ideal proportion and the emergence of the fully classical conception of the human form. The emergence of ideal proportion in Greek art represents a decisive transformation in how the human body is conceptualized, shifting from a form that is organized through visible alignment and observational adjustment into one that is constructed through an underlying system of measurable relations that govern every part simultaneously. What distinguishes this development is not the introduction of measurement as a technical aid, but the elevation of proportion into a generative principle, where the body is no longer assembled from parts that are later corrected, but produced from a framework that determines the size, placement, and interaction of those parts from the outset. The figure becomes intelligible as a structure before it is perceived as an image, and this structural intelligibility allows it to maintain coherence across variations, ensuring that the body can be replicated without losing its identity. This transformation cannot be reduced to an increase in realism, because realism alone would still depend on the variability of observed bodies, whereas ideal proportion seeks to eliminate that variability by replacing it with a system that defines what the body should be. The result is a form that appears natural while being entirely constructed, where the appearance of inevitability is the effect of a system that has successfully concealed its own operations. The conceptual foundation for this development is rooted in a broader Greek understanding of order as something that can be expressed through number, where numerical relationships are not merely descriptive, but constitutive of form itself, an idea that finds its most explicit articulation in the Pythagorean tradition, in which harmony is understood as the product of ratios that govern the relationship between elements across different domains. When applied to the human body, this perspective implies that the body can be defined not by its surface appearance, which is subject to change, but by a set of internal relations that remain consistent regardless of external conditions, thereby allowing the figure to function as a stable model rather than a contingent instance. The significance of this shift lies in its abstraction, because it detaches the body from the immediacy of perception and relocates it within a system that operates at a level that is not directly visible, where the relationships between parts can be articulated mathematically, even though they are experienced visually. This dual condition, in which the body is both constructed through abstract relations and perceived as a concrete form, creates a tension that defines the classical ideal, requiring the sculptor to reconcile the demands of structure with the expectations of perception in a way that does not privilege one at the expense of the other. The attempt to formalize this reconciliation is most closely associated with Polykleitos, whose canon proposes that the body can be generated through a system of proportional relationships that ensure coherence across the entire figure, a proposition that transforms the status of sculpture from the production of individual objects into the articulation of a model that can be instantiated repeatedly without losing its structural integrity. The importance of the canon does not depend on the recovery of its exact ratios, which remain uncertain, but on the conceptual claim that the body is not defined by the visible accumulations of parts, but by the invisible relationships that bind those parts together, allowing the figure to be understood as a unified system rather than a composite arrangement. This unity is not achieved through the elimination of difference, because the body still contains variations in scale, tension, and orientation, but through the regulation of those differences, so that they contribute to the overall coherence of the form rather than disrupting it. The figure thus becomes an expression of proportion, rather than an assembly of components, where each part is determined by its position within the system and cannot be altered without affecting the whole. The introduction of proportion as a generative principle also redefines the role of geometry in the construction of the body, because geometry provides a means of organizing relationships in a precise and consistent manner that can be applied across different contexts, allowing the sculptor to establish a framework within which the body can be inscribed and measured, without reducing it to a purely geometric abstraction. The use of geometric structures, whether explicit or implicit, enables the alignment of different parts of the body according to a set of guiding relations that ensure balance and symmetry at a higher level, where symmetry no longer refers to the direct mirroring of parts, but to the equilibrium of the system as a whole. This distinction is critical because it allows for the introduction of asymmetry within a controlled framework, where the distribution of weight and the orientation of limbs can vary without undermining the stability of the figure, thereby producing a form that appears dynamic while remaining structurally resolved. The body is no longer confined to a frontal plane that guarantees immediate legibility, but expands into space as a relational structure that must be understood through the interaction of its parts, requiring the viewer to engage with it from multiple perspectives in order to apprehend its full coherence. The relationship between proportion and perception introduces a further level of complexity, because the system must account not only for the internal organization of the body, but also for how that organization is experienced visually, ensuring that the figure appears balanced and harmonious under conditions that may distort its underlying geometry. This necessity gives rise to the practice of perceptual correction, in which the sculptor adjusts proportions in subtle ways to compensate for the effects of viewing angle, lighting, and spatial context, thereby maintaining the appearance of coherence even when the strict application of geometric ratios would produce distortions. The body is thus constructed through a system that is simultaneously abstract and responsive, where numerical relationships provide the framework, but are modified in relation to perceptual conditions, creating a form that is both structured and adaptable. This interplay between structure and perception aligns with the theoretical insights of Michael Baxendall, who emphasizes that visual representation is shaped by the expectations and interpretive habits of the viewer, suggesting that the success of the proportional system depends not only on its internal consistency, but on its ability to produce an experience that corresponds to those expectations. The integration of proportion into the construction of the body also transforms the relationship between parts and whole, because the size and position of each element are no longer determined independently, but derived from their relation to the system as a whole, creating a condition in which the figure can be understood as an indivisible structure, rather than a collection of separable components. This indivisibility is not absolute, because the parts can still be distinguished and analyzed, but it is functional, in that the meaning and appearance of each part depend on its relation to the others, preventing any single element from dominating the figure or disrupting its coherence. The body becomes a network of interdependent relations, where changes in one area necessitate adjustments in another, ensuring that the system remains balanced, even as it accommodates variation. This relational approach reflects a broader shift in Greek thought toward understanding complex phenomena as systems governed by underlying principles, rather than as aggregates of independent elements, reinforcing the idea that the body is not simply a visible object, but a structured entity that must be constructed through a process of rational organization. The implications of this transformation extend beyond the figure itself, because the proportional system establishes a model that can be applied to other domains, including architecture, where similar principles of relation and balance are used to organize space, suggesting that the body functions as a microcosm of a larger order that governs both form and environment. The correspondence between bodily proportion and architectural proportion is not coincidental, but reflects a shared conceptual framework in which harmony is achieved through the alignment of the parts within a system that operates at multiple scales, allowing the principles that define the body to inform the construction of space and vice versa. This extension of proportion into different domains reinforces its status as a fundamental principle of organization, rather than a technique limited to a specific medium, indicating that the invention of ideal proportion represents not only a development in sculpture, but a broader reorientation in how form is understood and constructed. The establishment of ideal proportion also introduces a new relationship between the individual figure and the concept of the type, because the body is no longer tied to a specific instance but functions as a general model that can be reproduced across different works while maintaining its structural identity. This generality does not eliminate variation, because individual figures may differ in surface detail or minor adjustments, but it ensures that these variations occur within a consistent framework, allowing the viewer to recognize the underlying system, even when the outward appearance changes. The type thus becomes a reference that defines what the body should be, providing a standard against which other representations can be measured and evaluated. This standard is not imposed externally, but emerges from the coherence of the system itself, gaining authority through its consistency rather than through explicit assertion. The authority of this system has significant consequences, because it shapes not only the production of art, but the perception of the body more broadly, establishing a framework that influences how bodies are seen, judged, and understood beyond the immediate context of sculpture. Once the body is defined through ideal proportion, it becomes difficult to perceive it outside this framework, as the relationships that constitute the ideal begin to inform expectations about what a body should look like, creating a feedback loop in which the model reinforces itself through repeated application. This process can be understood through the theoretical perspective of Erwin Panofsky, who argues that systems of representation function as symbolic forms that shape perception by organizing visual experience according to specific principles, suggesting that the classical body operates not only as an artistic construct, but as a cognitive framework that influences how the world is seen. The tension between abstraction and naturalness remains central to the functioning of the proportional system, because the body must appear convincing without revealing the mechanisms of its construction, requiring the sculptor to balance the strict application of ratios with subtle deviations that prevent the figure from becoming mechanical. These deviations are not arbitrary, but strategically introduced to enhance the perception of life, allowing the body to retain a sense of responsiveness while maintaining its structural coherence. The slight asymmetries in posture, the variations in muscle tension, and the adjustments in the orientation of the head and limbs all contribute to a form that appears dynamic without losing its stability, demonstrating that the ideal is not achieved through the elimination of difference, but through its regulation within a coherent system. The success of the figure depends on the viewer's inability to perceive the system directly, as the appearance of naturalness relies on the concealment of the underlying structure, creating an effect in which the body seems to exist independently of the principles that generate it. The invention of ideal proportion therefore marks a critical moment in the history of representation, where the body is no longer simply depicted, but systematically constructed through a framework that integrates number, geometry, and perception into a unified model capable of producing forms that appear both natural and controlled. This model does not resolve all tensions between structure and variability, but it establishes a method for managing those tensions in a way that allows the body to function as a stable reference across different contexts, ensuring its persistence as a foundational concept in the development of Western art. The figure that emerges from this system is not the body as it exists in lived experience, but the body as it can be defined through a set of relations that organize its form into a coherent and repeatable structure, demonstrating that what appears as perfection is not a discovery, but an invention. The redefinition of balance that occurs in the classical period is not a refinement of symmetry, but a structural reorientation in which equilibrium is produced through the coordination of unequal forces, requiring the body to be conceived as a system of relations rather than a set of corresponding parts. In the archaic figure, balance is achieved through bilateral equivalence, where the duplication of forms across the central axis ensures stability by eliminating difference, but this elimination also prevents the figure from registering the conditions under which actual bodies sustain themselves in space, as it suppresses the variability that arises from gravity, weight distribution, and muscular response. The classical solution does not abandon order, but relocates it within a dynamic framework, where stability emerges from the regulation of a symmetry, and where each deviation from symmetry is compensated by an adjustment elsewhere, producing a network of interdependencies that must be resolved into a coherent whole. This transformation aligns with broader developments in Greek thought, where equilibrium is understood not as the absence of difference, but as the controlled interaction of opposing forces, a principle that can be traced through philosophical, medical, and mathematical traditions, all of which emphasize the necessity of balance as a relational condition, rather than a static state. The mechanism through which this relational balance is realized in sculpture is the system of contrapposto, which introduces a redistribution of weight that transforms the entire structure of the body by shifting the center of gravity onto one leg, while allowing the other to remain free, thereby initiating a cascade of compensatory adjustments that extend through the pelvis, spine, shoulders, and head. The pelvis tilts in response to the load, creating an oblique axis that replaces the rigid verticality of the archaic figure, while the spine curves to maintain equilibrium, producing a subtle S-shaped alignment that distributes the weight of the torso in relation to the supporting leg, and the shoulders counterbalance this curvature by tilting in the opposite direction, ensuring that the mass of the upper body remains centered despite the asymmetry of the lower structure. This coordination is not a series of independent corrections, but a continuous system in which each adjustment necessitates another, creating a chain of relations that integrates the body into a unified structure that appears both stable and responsive. The significance of this system lies in its ability to produce a form that maintains equilibrium without relying on symmetry, thereby allowing the figure to incorporate variation while preserving coherence. The theoretical implications of this transformation can be clarified through the work of Rudolf Arnheim, whose analysis of visual perception emphasizes that balance in visual form is not achieved through the duplication of elements, but through the distribution of visual weight across a composition, where different parts interact to create a sense of equilibrium that is perceived rather than measured. Arnheim's framework provides a means of understanding contrapposto as a perceptual structure in which the asymmetry of the body generates tensions that are resolved through the alignment of opposing forces, producing a form that appears balanced despite its deviation from symmetry. The classical figure thus operates not only as a physical system, but as a perceptual one, where the arrangement of parts is calibrated to produce a specific visual effect that corresponds to the viewer's sense of equilibrium, ensuring that the figure is experienced as stable, even though its structure is inherently dynamic. The illusion of movement emerges from this dynamic equilibrium as a consequence of the body's internal organization, where the distribution of weight and the coordination of parts suggest the conditions under which movement could occur without depicting movement itself, creating a temporal dimension within a static form. The figure exists in a state of suspended action, where the shift of weight onto one leg implies the possibility of transition, and the orientation of the limbs suggests a sequence that extends beyond the present configuration, allowing the viewer to anticipate movement without witnessing it. This anticipation is not an added effect, but an intrinsic property of the system, as the relationships between parts are structured in such a way that they imply continuity across time, transforming the body from a static object into a process that is momentarily stabilized. The significance of this transformation lies in its ability to engage the viewer's perception in a way that extends beyond the immediate appearance of the figure, requiring the viewer to interpret the structure as an indication of potential rather than as a fixed state. The role of musculature in sustaining this illusion is critical, as the surface of the body becomes a site where internal dynamics are registered through variations in tension and relaxation, allowing the figure to convey the effects of weight distribution without explicitly depicting the forces that produce them. Muscles that bear weight are rendered with increased definition, while those that are not engaged appear softer, creating a differentiation that corresponds to the asymmetrical structure of the body and reinforces its sense of responsiveness. This differentiation does not result in a purely anatomical representation, as the goal remains the construction of a coherent system rather than the reproduction of the body in all its complexity, but it introduces a level of specificity that aligns the surface of the figure with its underlying structure, ensuring that the appearance of the body reflects its internal organization. The surface thus functions as an interface between structure and perception, where the viewer can infer the dynamics of the body from the visible configuration of forms. The integration of these elements into a unified system reflects a broader conceptual shift in which the body is understood as an organism rather than as an assemblage of parts, requiring a mode of representation that can account for the interdependence of its components and the continuity of its structure. This shift can be analyzed through the theoretical framework of Ernst Gombrich, who argues that representation operates through schemata that organize perception, suggesting that the classical body emerges from a schema that prioritizes relational coherence over static clarity. The figure is not constructed by adding details to a pre-existing structure, but by applying a system that determines how those details interact, producing a form that appears both natural and controlled without revealing the processes that generate it. The illusion of movement is therefore not an isolated feature, but a manifestation of the underlying schema, which organizes the body in such a way that it appears capable of action while remaining stable. The relationship between the figure and the viewer is also transformed by this development, as the illusion of movement depends on the viewer's ability to perceive the relational structure of the body and to interpret it as an indication of potential action, creating an interaction in which the viewer participates in the completion of the image by projecting continuity onto a static form. This interaction can be understood through the theoretical perspective of Michael Bakendall, who emphasizes that visual representation is shaped by the interpretive habits of its audience, indicating that the effectiveness of the illusion depends on the viewer's capacity to recognize the structural cues that suggest movement, and to integrate them into a coherent perception. The figure does not contain movement in itself, but provides the conditions under which movement can be perceived, requiring the viewer to engage with the system in a way that extends beyond passive observation. The conceptual relationship between balance and movement can also be situated within the philosophical context of Aristotle, whose analysis of motion and potentiality distinguishes between states of actuality and states of potential, where an object may possess the capacity for change without undergoing change itself. The classical figure embodies this distinction, as it presents the body in a state of potential movement, where the conditions for action are present but not realized, allowing the form to remain stable while suggesting continuity across time. This alignment with Aristotelian thought reinforces the idea that the illusion of movement is not a departure from stability, but a refinement of it, where stability is redefined as the capacity to sustain potential without collapse. The coordination of asymmetry within a stable system also reflects broader mathematical and geometric principles, where equilibrium is achieved through the balancing of unequal elements, rather than through their duplication, suggesting that the body operates according to a logic that can be understood in relation to systems that govern other domains of knowledge. The integration of these principles into the construction of the figure demonstrates that the classical body is not merely an artistic invention, but a manifestation of a broader intellectual framework in which form is understood as the result of relations that can be analyzed and organized according to consistent rules. The body thus becomes a site where abstract principles are realized visually, creating a correspondence between theoretical concepts and perceptual experience. The persistence of the classical model in later periods, particularly in the Renaissance, where the study of contrapposto becomes central to artistic practice, indicates the durability of the system that produces the illusion of movement, as it provides a framework that can be adapted to different contexts while maintaining its coherence. The continued use of this system reflects its effectiveness in balancing the demands of stability and dynamism, allowing the body to be represented as both a stable form and a responsive entity, and reinforcing its status as a standard that defines how movement is understood in visual terms. The illusion of movement, therefore, is not an effect that can be isolated from the structure of the figure, but a consequence of the system that organizes it, where balance is achieved through the coordination of differences that produce a dynamic equilibrium capable of sustaining both stability and potential. The figure appears alive, not because it moves, but because it is constructed in a way that makes movement conceivable, engaging the viewer's perception in a process that extends beyond the visible form and into the realm of possibility, demonstrating that what appears as life is the result of a carefully regulated structure that balances opposing forces within a coherent system. The classical face is constructed within a system that regulates variation in order to sustain coherence, and its refusal of overt emotional expression must be understood as a structural necessity rather than as a stylistic restraint or technical limitation. The face, unlike the body, presents a particular challenge to any system that seeks to produce stability, because it is the site where variability is most immediately perceived and where deviation from a norm is most legible. Minor alterations in the configuration of the eyes, the tension of the mouth, or the alignment of the brows can produce significant differences in perceived emotional state, introducing a level of instability that cannot be easily reconciled with a system based on proportional harmony and relational balance. The classical solution is not to eliminate the face's capacity for variation, but to regulate it within limits that prevent it from disrupting the coherence of the figure, producing a controlled neutrality that aligns the face with the structural logic of the body, while maintaining its perceptual clarity. This regulation can be analyzed through the framework of Rudolf Arnheim, whose theory of visual balance emphasizes that perception organizes forms into stable configurations by minimizing tensions that cannot be resolved within the composition. In this context, strong emotional expressions would introduce perceptual tensions that draw attention to localized areas of the figure, fragmenting the unity of the form and disrupting the distribution of visual weight across the body. The classical face avoids this fragmentation by maintaining a state in which no single feature dominates the perception of the whole, ensuring that the face contributes to the overall equilibrium rather than competing with it. The absence of emotion is therefore not a negation but a calibration, where the face is adjusted to function as a stabilizing component within a larger perceptual system. The transition from the archaic smile to the classical neutral expression reflects a shift in how vitality is conveyed, moving from a symbolic indicator applied uniformly across figures to a more integrated system in which life is suggested through the coordination of the entire body rather than through a localized feature. The archaic smile operates as a convention that signals animation without requiring structural justification, allowing the figure to avoid appearing inert while maintaining its rigid symmetry. Its uniform application, however, limits its capacity to engage perception, as it does not correspond to any identifiable state or to the internal organization of the body. The classical removal of this feature is not a move toward emotional realism, but toward structural consistency, where the face must align with the same relational logic that governs the body, ensuring that all parts of the figure operate according to a unified system. The concept of alignment between face and body can be further understood through the work of Erwin Panofsky, whose analysis of symbolic forms emphasizes that visual representation reflects underlying conceptual structures that organize how reality is perceived and constructed. The classical face participates in a symbolic form that prioritizes universality and coherence, requiring that individual variation be subordinated to a general model that can be recognized across different instances. The absence of emotion is therefore a condition of this universality, as it prevents the face from becoming tied to a specific moment or individual state, allowing it to function as part of a system that transcends particularity. The philosophical implications of this approach can be situated within the ethical framework of Greek thought, particularly in relation to the concept of measured expression and the avoidance of excess, which are central to the notion of Sophrosine. The classical face embodies this principle by maintaining a controlled neutrality that reflects a state of internal regulation, where emotion is neither absent nor expressed, but contained within a balanced structure. This containment does not deny the existence of emotion, but positions it as something that must be governed in order to maintain equilibrium, aligning the visual representation of the face with broader cultural values that emphasize restraint and order. The relationship between emotion and representation can also be examined through the theoretical lens of David Friedberg, whose work on the power of images explores how visual representations can evoke emotional responses in viewers. In the classical context, the suppression of explicit emotional cues does not eliminate the viewer's response, but redirects it, shifting the focus from empathetic identification with the figure to an engagement with its structure and coherence. The viewer is not invited to interpret the face as an expression of a particular internal state, but to recognize it as part of a system that operates according to principles that can be perceived and analyzed. The emotional effect of the figure, therefore, arises not from the depiction of emotion, but from the stability and harmony of its form, producing a different kind of engagement that is grounded in perception rather than narrative. The absence of individualized expression also reflects the distinction between type and portrait, where the goal of representation is to construct a general model rather than to capture the unique features of a specific individual. The classical face does not aim to record identity in the way that later portrait traditions will, but to define a standard that can be applied across different figures, ensuring that the system remains consistent. This approach aligns with the broader Greek interest in categorization and classification, where understanding is achieved through the identification of general principles rather than through the accumulation of particular details. The face, in this context, functions as a component of a typological system where variation is allowed, but must remain within the limits that define the type. The theoretical significance of this typological approach can be further explored through the philosophy of Plato, whose concept of ideal forms suggests that the visible world participates in a higher level of reality that is characterized by permanence and consistency. While classical sculpture does not explicitly depict Platonic forms, its emphasis on generality and coherence reflects a similar orientation, where the representation of the body aims to approximate a stable structure that transcends individual variation. The face, by avoiding particularity, aligns with this orientation, functioning as a visual analogue to the idea of the form, where the emphasis is placed on what is consistent rather than on what is unique. At the same time, the classical face must remain perceptually convincing, which requires a level of anatomical plausibility that prevents it from appearing abstract or artificial. The features are arranged according to observed relationships, and the transitions between them are smoothed to create a sense of continuity, ensuring that the face appears natural even as it is regulated by the system. This balance between observation and construction can be understood through the framework of Ernst Gombrich, who emphasizes that representation involves the adjustment of schemata in response to observation, producing forms that are both structured and responsive. The classical face is not a direct transcription of observation, but a constructed form that incorporates observational elements in a way that maintains its coherence within the system. The interaction between the face and the viewer is also shaped by this construction, as the absence of explicit emotional cues requires the viewer to engage with the figure in a different way, focusing on the relationships between features and their integration into the whole, rather than on the interpretation of expression. This mode of engagement aligns with the analytical approach that characterizes classical representation, where the emphasis is placed on understanding the structure of the figure, rather than on responding to its emotional content. The viewer is positioned as an observer of a system, rather than as a participant in a narrative, reinforcing the conceptual orientation of the work. The stability of the classical face also contributes to the temporal dimension of the figure, as the absence of emotion prevents it from being tied to a specific moment, allowing it to exist in a state that appears continuous rather than transient. Emotion, by contrast, is inherently temporal, associated with change and fluctuation, and its inclusion would anchor the figure within a particular instant, limiting its capacity to function as a model. The neutral face avoids this limitation maintaining a presence that is not defined by time, and reinforcing the perception of the figure as a stable and enduring form. The persistence of this approach in later traditions demonstrates its effectiveness as a system for constructing the human figure in a way that balances perceptual clarity with structural coherence. The Renaissance revival of classical principles retains the controlled treatment of the face, even as it introduces greater attention to individual features and psychological nuance, indicating that the underlying concept of the face as a regulated surface remains central to the construction of the ideal. The continued influence of this model suggests that the absence of emotion is not a limitation, but a condition that enables the face to function within a system that prioritizes stability and universality. The classical face, in its controlled neutrality, defines a boundary within which variation can occur without disrupting the coherence of the figure, ensuring that the system remains consistent across different instances, while allowing for subtle differences that contribute to its perceptual richness. This boundary is maintained through the regulation of features, the smoothing of transitions, and the avoidance of extremes, creating a form that appears natural and stable while remaining structured and controlled. The absence of emotion is therefore not an absence of meaning, but a deliberate condition that supports the operation of the system, demonstrating that restraint can function as a positive force in the construction of representation. The face becomes, in this sense, a site where the principles of the classical system are most clearly articulated, as it reveals how variation can be incorporated without undermining coherence, and how the suppression of certain elements can enhance the stability of the whole. The neutrality of the face is not a reduction, but a refinement, allowing the figure to maintain its integrity while engaging the viewer in a mode of perception that emphasizes structure, relation, and balance. The classical face does not communicate emotion in the conventional sense, but it communicates the conditions under which the figure exists, providing a key to understanding the system that produces it. The establishment of the male body as a standard within Greek art is inseparable from a broader epistemic transformation, in which knowledge is organized through relations that can be measured, compared, and stabilized, and where the body becomes a privileged site for the articulation of these relations because it offers a structure that can be both internally coherent and externally legible. The body does not merely occupy space, but provides a framework through which space, proportion, and order can be understood, allowing it to function as a mediator between abstract principles and perceptual experience. This mediation depends on the construction of a body that is sufficiently regular to sustain measurement, while remaining sufficiently complex to appear natural, requiring a system that can reconcile these demands without collapsing into either rigidity or variability. The classical solution is not to eliminate difference, but to regulate it within a structure that maintains commensurability across parts, ensuring that each element can be related to the whole through ratios that are consistent and repeatable. The articulation of this system is most closely associated with polykleitos, whose canon is understood as a methodological framework rather than a fixed set of numerical prescriptions, emphasizing the principle of symmetria as the proportional correspondence between parts that produces a coherent whole. The significance of symmetria lies in its relational character, as it does not define proportion in isolation, but as a network of interdependent ratios that extend throughout the body, creating a structure in which no part can be altered without affecting the others. This relational system is exemplified in works such as the Doryphoros, where the distribution of weight through contrapposto is integrated with proportional relationships that ensure the figure remains balanced despite its asymmetry. The right leg bears the weight, the left remains relaxed, the pelvis tilts, the shoulders counterbalance, and the head aligns with the overall axis, producing a configuration in which movement and stability are reconciled through the coordination of parts. The the figure does not simply follow a set of proportions. It enacts a system in which proportion and movement are inseparable. The theoretical implications of this system can be clarified through the framework of Erwin Panofsky, who describes proportion as a means of translating abstract relationships into visual form, suggesting that the classical body operates as a symbolic structure in which numerical relations are embodied in a way that can be perceived without explicit calculation. The body becomes a diagram of proportional logic, where the relationships between parts are not only measurable but visible, allowing the viewer to apprehend the coherence of the system through perception. This visibility is essential, as it ensures that the system can function as a model that is both intelligible and convincing, bridging the gap between theoretical abstraction and sensory experience. The role of the male body within this system is not determined by its empirical characteristics, but by its capacity to sustain the requirements of proportional coherence, as it is constructed in a way that emphasizes clarity of structure, definition of musculature, and alignment of parts, allowing the relationships that define the system to be articulated without ambiguity. The visibility of these relationships is critical because it enables the body to function as a reference that can be studied, replicated, and adapted, ensuring the transmission of the system across different works and contexts. The male figure becomes a pedagogical model, where the principles of proportion can be demonstrated and internalized, reinforcing its position as a standard. The integration of mathematical principles into the construction of the body reflects a broader Greek engagement with number and ratio, particularly within the Pythagorean tradition, where harmony is understood as the result of numerical relationships that can be expressed through ratios. The application of these principles to the body suggests that form can be organized according to the same logic that governs musical harmony, creating a correspondence between different domains of knowledge that reinforces the universality of the system. The body, thus, becomes a site where mathematical relationships are made perceptible, aligning visual representation with theoretical constructs in a way that supports the coherence of the model. The extension of this proportional logic into architecture further demonstrates the centrality of the body as a measure, as the relationships that define the figure are applied to the organization of space, creating a correspondence between human proportions and architectural structures that reinforces the idea of the body as a standard. This correspondence is articulated explicitly by Vitruvius, who describes the human body as a source of proportional systems that can be used to design buildings, suggesting that the relationships between parts of the body can be mapped onto the relationships between elements of a structure. The famous diagram of the body, inscribed within a circle and a square, later visualized by Leonardo da Vinci, exemplifies this principle, demonstrating how the body can serve as a geometric and proportional reference that connects the human figure to the organization of space. The privilege of the male body within this framework can be further examined through the theoretical perspective of Michel Foucault, whose analysis of normative structures emphasizes that standards are produced through systems that define what is considered normal, regulating variation, and establishing criteria for evaluation. The classical male body functions as such a standard, where the proportional system defines the parameters within which bodies can be understood and assessed, creating a framework that extends beyond representation into broader cultural practices. The body is not simply depicted, it is constructed as a norm that shapes perception and evaluation, influencing how other bodies are interpreted in relation to it. The exclusion or marginalization of other bodies within this system is not incidental but structural, as the system requires a level of consistency that may not accommodate forms that do not align with its principles. The female body, while present within Greek art, is often treated differently, with a greater emphasis on surface continuity and less emphasis on the articulation of internal structure, reflecting a different set of representational priorities that do not position it as the primary site for the articulation of proportion. This distinction does not imply a lack of sophistication, but indicates that the male body occupies a specific role within the system as a model that defines the terms of measurement, while other bodies are represented in relation to this standard. The perceptual effectiveness of the male body as a measure depends on its ability to appear natural and self-evident, masking the constructed nature of the system and allowing it to function as a baseline for understanding. This masking can be analyzed through the framework of Ernst Gombrich, who argues that representation operates through the adjustment of schemata that become internalized, leading viewers to perceive constructed forms as natural. The classical body exemplifies this process, as its proportional relationships are not immediately recognized as artificial, but are experienced as harmonious, reinforcing the authority of the system without requiring explicit justification. The role of perception in sustaining this system is further emphasized by Rudolf Arnheim, whose analysis of visual balance suggests that the human perceptual system favors configurations that distribute weight and tension in a way that produces equilibrium. The classical male body aligns with these perceptual tendencies, as its proportions and structure create a sense of balance that corresponds to the viewer's intuitive understanding of stability, enhancing its effectiveness as a model. The body is not only mathematically coherent, but perceptually satisfying, ensuring that the system resonates with the viewer's experience. The integration of movement into this proportional system further reinforces its complexity, as the introduction of contrapposto requires the relationships between parts to be adjusted dynamically, ensuring that the figure remains coherent despite the asymmetry introduced by the shift in weight. This dynamic adjustment demonstrates that the system is not rigid, but adaptable, capable of accommodating variation, while maintaining its underlying structure. The body thus becomes a site where stability and movement are reconciled, producing a form that appears both controlled and responsive. The philosophical dimension of the body as a measure can also be related to the statement attributed to Protagoras, who asserts that the human being is the measure of all things, suggesting that knowledge and perception are grounded in human experience. While this statement is not directly linked to the proportional systems of sculpture, it reflects a broader orientation in which the body serves as a reference for understanding the world, aligning with the use of the body as a standard within artistic practice. The classical male body can be seen as a specific instantiation of this principle, where the body is not only measured, but functions as the basis for measurement. The persistence of this model in later periods demonstrates its adaptability and influence, as the Renaissance revival of classical principles reaffirms the centrality of the male body as a standard for proportion and representation, extending its application to new contexts while maintaining its underlying logic. Artists, such as Leon Battista Alberti and Albrecht Dürer, developed treatises on proportion that build upon classical foundations, further formalizing the relationship between the body and measurement, and reinforcing its role as a model that can be analyzed and reproduced. The male body, in this context, is not simply an object of representation, but a structure that organizes representation, functioning as a framework through which relationships can be established and maintained. Its role as a measure extends beyond its physical form, as it provides a system that can be applied to different domains, from sculpture to architecture, from visual perception to theoretical analysis. The body becomes a nexus where multiple forms of knowledge converge, demonstrating that its significance lies not in its appearance alone, but in its capacity to sustain a system that defines how form is understood. The implications of this construction extend into the broader question of how standards are established and maintained, as the elevation of the male body as a measure involves the selection and reinforcement of certain qualities while excluding others, creating a system that defines what is considered correct or ideal. This definition does not remain confined to artistic practice, but influences how bodies are perceived and evaluated more generally, demonstrating the capacity of representation to shape perception in ways that extend beyond the objects themselves. The classical male body thus occupies a central position within a system that integrates proportion, perception, and representation, functioning as a site where abstract principles are realized in a form that can be apprehended visually. Its role as a measure reflects not only its construction, but its function, as it provides a framework through which other forms can be organized and understood, reinforcing the coherence of the system and ensuring its persistence across different contexts. The representation of the female body in Greek art develops through a system that cannot be understood as secondary to the male figure, but must instead be examined as a parallel construction governed by distinct perceptual, structural, and cultural conditions, where the body is not primarily articulated through measurable segmentation, but through the continuity of surface and the regulation of visibility. The female form does not reject proportion, but redistributes proportional logic across a field that resists explicit articulation, embedding relational order within transitions that are smoothed, integrated, and extended, rather than clearly divided. This produces a figure that remains structurally coherent while limiting the visibility of the underlying system, requiring the viewer to perceive order through continuity rather than through contrast. The result is not a reduction of complexity, but a displacement of it, where the organization of the body is no longer legible through discrete parts, but through the modulation of an unbroken surface that sustains perceptual unity. In archaic sculpture, the female figure is constructed through drapery that functions not as concealment, but as an alternative system of articulation, where the body is encoded within the rhythm and repetition of folds, producing a structure that substitutes pattern for anatomy, while maintaining coherence through alignment and symmetry. The core figures, particularly those from the Athenian Acropolis, demonstrate this logic with precision, as the vertical cascades of fabric establish a visual order that parallels the axial stability of the body, allowing the figure to maintain its integrity without exposing internal structure. The drapery operates as a diagrammatic surface, where the repetition of lines produces a sense of continuity that organizes perception while preventing fragmentation. The body is not absent, but displaced into a system that prioritizes legibility through pattern rather than through direct anatomical articulation. The persistence of drapery as a structuring device introduces a condition in which the female form is always mediated, requiring the viewer to reconstruct the body through inference rather than direct observation. This mode of perception aligns with the theoretical framework of Ernst Gombrich, whose concept of schemata suggests that representation operates through systems that guide recognition by providing structured cues rather than complete information. The folds of the garment function as such cues, allowing the viewer to reconstruct the body mentally while maintaining the integrity of the surface, producing a dual operation in which perception oscillates between surface and structure without fully resolving either. The transition into the classical period does not abandon this mediated condition, but transforms it through the development of what has been described as the wet drapery effect, where the fabric adheres to the body, revealing its contours while preserving its own presence, creating a layered structure in which visibility and concealment coexist. The figures from the east pediment of the Parthenon, often attributed to the workshop of Phidias, exemplify this transformation, as the garments cling to the body in a way that allows the underlying volumes to emerge without eliminating the surface as an active component. The folds trace the curvature of the torso, the bending of the knee, and the shifting of weight, producing a surface that simultaneously reveals and constructs the body. This duality creates a perceptual complexity in which the viewer must integrate multiple layers of information, reinforcing the coherence of the figure while maintaining the mediation that defines its structure. The emergence of fully revealed female figures introduces a new condition in which the body must sustain coherence without the organizing function of drapery, requiring a reconfiguration of how structure is distributed across the form. The solution is not to replicate the articulation of the male figure, but to construct a system in which continuity replaces segmentation as the primary means of organization, producing a body that is defined through the gradual transition of volumes, rather than through the clear differentiation of parts. This approach is most clearly articulated in the work of Praxiteles, whose Aphrodite of Knidos establishes a new paradigm for the representation of the female form by organizing the body as a continuous flow of surfaces that integrate torso, hips, and limbs into a unified whole. The contrapposta stance introduces asymmetry, yet the effect is absorbed into the continuity of the surface, producing a balance that is achieved through integration rather than through the opposition of forces. The structural difference between male and female bodies within this system can be further clarified through the theoretical distinction proposed by Heinrich Wülflin, where linear form emphasizes clarity and separation, and painterly form emphasizes continuity and integration. The male figure operates within a linear logic, where each part is defined and articulated in relation to others, while the female figure anticipates a painterly logic, where form is perceived as a continuous field in which boundaries are softened and transitions are emphasized. This distinction does not indicate a chronological progression, but reveals the coexistence of multiple visual logics within the same cultural framework, demonstrating that the classical system is not monolithic, but capable of accommodating different modes of representation. The perceptual basis of this distinction can be examined through the work of Rudolf Arnheim, whose analysis of visual organization emphasizes the role of continuity in producing stable perceptual completeness. The female body, with its smooth transitions and integrated volumes, aligns with the tendency of perception to resolve forms into unified structures, reducing the need for the viewer to reconcile conflicting elements. The absence of sharp segmentation minimizes perceptual tension, allowing the figure to be experienced as complete and coherent without requiring analytical reconstruction. This perceptual economy enhances the stability of the form, ensuring that it can be apprehended immediately while still sustaining structural complexity. The introduction of the female form as a visible body also reconfigures the relationship between the figure and the viewer, as the orientation of the body often anticipates observation, creating a condition in which the figure is positioned within a field of vision that includes the viewer as an implicit participant. This dynamic can be examined through the theoretical framework of John Berger, who identifies a distinction between bodies that act and bodies that are presented for viewing, suggesting that the female figure in Western art is often constructed in relation to the gaze. While Berger's analysis is historically later, it provides a lens through which the positioning of the female body in Greek art can be understood, as the figure's posture, gesture, and orientation often align with a mode of presentation that anticipates visual engagement. The integration of this visual relationship into the structure of the figure does not undermine its coherence, but introduces a different mode of organization, where the body is constructed to be apprehended through continuity and accessibility, rather than through structural analysis. The figure becomes a surface that invites perception, guiding the viewer's gaze across its contours in a way that reinforces its unity. This guidance aligns with the broader system of Greek art, where perception is structured and directed, but it operates through a different mechanism, relying on flow rather than segmentation. The distinction between male and female bodies can also be situated within the theoretical perspective of Michel Foucault, whose analysis of the body as a site of regulation suggests that different forms of representation correspond to different modes of knowledge and control. The male body, constructed as a system of measurable relations, functions as a standard that defines norms, while the female body, constructed through continuity and visibility, reflects a different mode in which perception is guided through surface rather than through structure. These modes do not exist in opposition, but in parallel, creating a framework in which multiple systems of representation operate simultaneously. The transformation of the female form is further complicated by the persistence of drapery alongside more exposed representations, indicating that the system does not evolve linearly, but expands to include multiple approaches to the construction of the body. The draped figures of the late classical period continue to explore the interaction between surface and structure, producing variations that demonstrate the flexibility of the system. The coexistence of these modes suggests that the problem of representing the female body is not resolved through a single solution, but remains open, allowing for continuous exploration within the framework. The influence of this system extends into the Hellenistic period, where the female form becomes increasingly dynamic and expressive, yet the emphasis on continuity and surface remains, demonstrating the persistence of the classical framework, even as it is adapted to new conditions. Works such as the Aphrodite of Melos reveal a continuation of the integrated surface, while introducing new complexities in pose and interaction with space, indicating that the system can accommodate increased variation without losing coherence. The reception of the female form in the Renaissance further reinforces the durability of this model as artists return to classical precedents while adapting them to new intellectual and cultural contexts. The study of the female body becomes an essential component of artistic practice, yet the emphasis on continuity, proportion, and perceptual coherence remains central, demonstrating that the principles established in Greek art continue to shape the construction of the body across different periods. The female form, in its transformation, reveals the capacity of the classical system to accommodate multiple modes of representation while maintaining its underlying coherence, demonstrating that the construction of the body is not confined to a single model, but can operate through different logics that are integrated within the same framework. The emphasis on continuity, surface, and modulation does not represent a departure from the system, but an expansion of its possibilities, allowing it to incorporate variation while preserving its structural integrity. The female body thus functions as a critical component of the system, revealing its flexibility and complexity, and demonstrating that coherence can be achieved through multiple pathways that reflect different perceptual and conceptual priorities. The distinction between the male and female body within Greek art has often been interpreted through a hierarchical framework in which one form is treated as primary and the other as derivative. Yet such an interpretation imposes a structure that does not accurately reflect the internal logic of the system, where difference does not function as a marker of value, but as a condition of variation within a unified framework. The male body, articulated through measurable relations and structural clarity, and the female body, organized through continuity and modulation, do not occupy opposing positions within a hierarchy, but operate as parallel constructions that fulfill different functions within the same system of representation. The coherence of the system depends not on the dominance of one form over another, but on the capacity to sustain multiple modes of organization without collapsing into inconsistency. The concept of hierarchy presupposes a linear arrangement in which forms can be ranked according to a single standard, yet the classical system does not operate according to a singular criterion that can be applied uniformly across all representations. The male body functions as a model of proportion and commensurability, where relations between parts are explicitly articulated and can be measured and analyzed, while the female body functions as a model of continuity and perceptual cohesion, where relations are embedded within the surface and apprehended through integration rather than through segmentation. These functions are not interchangeable, but they are equally necessary for the operation of the system, as they demonstrate different ways in which coherence can be achieved. The theoretical implications of this distinction can be understood through the framework of Ernst Cassirer, whose concept of symbolic forms suggests that human understanding is structured through multiple systems that organize experience in different ways, none of which can be reduced to a single hierarchy. Within this framework, the male and female bodies can be seen as distinct symbolic forms that articulate different aspects of perception and representation, each providing a mode of organization that contributes to the overall coherence of the system. The presence of multiple symbolic forms does not imply fragmentation, but a structured plurality in which different logics coexist and interact. The persistence of both forms within Greek art indicates that the system does not resolve difference by eliminating it, but by integrating it into a framework that allows for variation without disruption. The male figure does not replace the female figure, nor does the female figure serve as a variation of the male model. Each is constructed according to principles that are consistent within themselves and compatible with the broader system, demonstrating that coherence does not require uniformity. This compatibility can be observed in the way both forms engage with balance, proportion, and movement, even as they articulate these principles differently. The relationship between difference and coherence can also be analyzed through the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, whose structuralist approach emphasizes that meaning is generated through relations between elements, rather than through the intrinsic properties of individual components. Within this perspective, the distinction between male and female bodies does not derive its significance from the characteristics of each form in isolation, but from the relational system that connects them, where difference functions as a means of structuring the field rather than as a basis for evaluation. The system relies on contrast, but this contrast does not produce hierarchy. It produces differentiation that allows the system to articulate multiple modes of organization. The avoidance of hierarchy is also consistent with the broader Greek emphasis on balance and proportion, where equilibrium is achieved through the regulation of opposing forces, rather than through their subordination. The male and female bodies can be understood as occupying different positions within a field of relations that must be maintained in balance, ensuring that no single mode dominates to the extent that it disrupts the coherence of the system. This balance is not static, but dynamic, allowing the system to adapt and evolve while preserving its underlying structure. The role of perception in sustaining this non-hierarchical structure is critical, as the viewer must be able to recognize the coherence of each form without imposing a singular standard that privileges one over the other. This requires a mode of perception that is sensitive to variation and capable of apprehending different types of order, aligning with the analysis of Rudolf Arnheim, who emphasizes that visual perception operates through the organization of relations rather than through the identification of isolated elements. The viewer does not evaluate the forms according to a fixed scale, but engages with each, according to the principles that define it, allowing multiple modes of coherence to be perceived simultaneously. The interpretation of difference without hierarchy also challenges later frameworks that impose value judgments based on criteria that are external to the classical system, such as the prioritization of structural clarity over surface continuity, or the elevation of measurement over perception. These frameworks reflect different historical and cultural contexts, and cannot be retroactively applied without distorting the internal logic of Greek art. The classical system must be understood on its own terms, where the coexistence of different modes of representation is not a problem to be resolved, but a condition to be maintained. The implications of this perspective extend beyond the analysis of Greek art into broader questions of how systems of representation organize difference, suggesting that the presence of variation does not necessarily imply inequality, but can function as a means of sustaining complexity within a coherent framework. The male and female bodies, in this context, are not competing forms but complementary structures that expand the possibilities of representation, demonstrating that coherence can be achieved through multiple pathways. The recognition of difference without hierarchy allows for a more precise understanding of how the classical system operates, as it reveals that the apparent contrast between forms is not a sign of imbalance, but of structural differentiation, where each form contributes to the overall organization of the system in a distinct way. This recognition shifts the focus from comparison to relation, emphasizing the connections between forms rather than their ranking, and providing a framework for analyzing representation that is consistent with the principles that govern the works themselves. The system does not eliminate differences, nor does it resolve it into a single model. It sustains it, integrating multiple forms into a structure that remains coherent precisely because it accommodates variation. The male body and the female body, in their respective constructions, demonstrate that the ideal is not singular, but plural, and that the stability of the system depends on its ability to maintain this plurality without collapsing into inconsistency. The relation between human and divine in Greek art is not constructed through categorical separation, but through a calibrated continuum in which the body functions as a shared structural system capable of sustaining different degrees of refinement without altering its fundamental organization, producing a framework in which the distinction between human and divine is embedded within the regulation of proportion, balance, and coherence, rather than expressed through visible transformation. And this continuity reflects a broader Greek conception, in which the gods are not imagined as possessing fundamentally different bodies, but as inhabiting the same visible structure, while operating under conditions that exceed human limitation, allowing the same form to function across different conceptual domains, without requiring alteration into an entirely distinct ontology. The divine body does not emerge as an alternative to the human body, but as an intensification of its internal logic, where variability is reduced, proportional relations are stabilized, and the appearance of contingency is minimized, producing a figure that appears complete, self-contained, and resistant to change while remaining entirely recognizable within the human framework. This structural continuity can be understood through the theoretical framework articulated by Erwin Panofsky, who describes representation as operating through symbolic forms that encode conceptual distinctions within relational systems rather than through overt markers, suggesting that the divine body does not require the addition of supernatural attributes, but is constructed through the refinement of the same proportional schema that governs human representation, allowing the figure to signify a different conceptual state through the precision with which its internal relations are resolved. The divine is therefore not made visible through difference in kind, but through difference in degree, where the same system is extended to produce a higher level of coherence, demonstrating that the body itself is sufficient to articulate the distinction when organized according to a refined structure. The role of proportion as the foundation of this system is established in the tradition associated with Polykleitos, whose canon provides a method for constructing the body through commensurable ratios that ensure coherence across the figure, allowing each part to relate to the whole through a network of measurable relations that can be maintained even as the figure changes in pose or scale, and this system creates the conditions under which the divine body can be produced through refinement rather than transformation, as the same proportional logic is applied with increasing precision, reducing deviations and stabilizing relations to produce a form that appears more resolved than its human counterpart. The Doryphoros, while not representing a god, demonstrates how balance can be achieved through asymmetry, introducing a dynamic equilibrium that becomes the basis for later developments. And in divine figures, this equilibrium is presented without the appearance of adjustment, producing a condition in which balance appears inherent rather than achieved. The narratives of Greek mythology reinforce this structural continuity by presenting gods and mortals as occupying the same physical framework, demonstrating that the distinction between them does not require a different body, but a different relation to the same body, and the repeated transformations of Zeus into forms that allow him to move within the human world without disrupting visual continuity indicate that divinity does not depend on visible differentiation, but can exist within the same structure, suggesting that the divine body is not defined by its appearance, but by the conditions under which it operates. Zeus does not require a different anatomy to assert his presence, and when he appears among humans, the body remains consistent with the system that governs all representation, reinforcing the idea that the distinction between human and divine is not located in form, but in interpretation. The myth of Semele introduces a critical limit to this continuity, as her request to see Zeus in his full divine state results in destruction, indicating that the divine cannot be directly perceived in its unmediated intensity and must be presented through a form that remains within the bounds of human perception. And this narrative provides a conceptual foundation for the sculptural practice of maintaining structural continuity, as it demonstrates that the divine must be rendered in a way that can be apprehended, requiring a form that aligns with the perceptual capacities of the viewer, while suggesting a level of refinement that exceeds ordinary experience. The divine body therefore functions as a mediated form, allowing the viewer to engage with the concept of divinity without encountering its full intensity. The figure of Athena provides a particularly significant case for understanding how the divine body operates within this system, as her identity is not constructed through transformation of form, but through the integration of attributes that align with the existing structure, producing a figure that remains fully coherent within the human framework, while embodying a distinct conceptual presence. Athena emerges fully formed from the head of Zeus, not as a developing body, but as a complete and resolved figure, indicating that the divine body is characterized by its immediate coherence, rather than by a process of formation. And this narrative aligns with the sculptural representation of Athena in works such as the Athena Parthenos, where the body is constructed with a precision that emphasizes stability and order, reinforcing her association with wisdom and strategic clarity. The presence of armor and drapery in representations of Athena does not obscure the underlying structure of the body, but operates in relation to it, allowing the figure to maintain coherence while introducing elements that articulate her identity, demonstrating that the divine body can incorporate additional features without disrupting its proportional logic. The drapery follows the contours of the body, revealing its structure rather than concealing it, and the armor aligns with the underlying form, reinforcing the sense of stability and control that defines her representation. Athena's body is not altered to signify divinity, but is organized in a way that reflects her conceptual attributes, demonstrating that the system can accommodate variation without losing coherence. The philosophical implications of this construction can be further understood through the work of Jean-Pierre Vernant, who emphasizes that Greek gods are defined not by a separate physical ontology, but by their position within a network of relations that distinguishes them from humans through function and agency, rather than through form, suggesting that the divine body operates as a relational construct that derives its meaning from its position within the system, rather than from its intrinsic characteristics. Athena's identity is therefore not located in the structure of her body, but in the way that structure is organized and interpreted within the broader framework. The representation of Apollo further illustrates how the divine body is constructed through the refinement of proportional relations, as his association with harmony and order is reflected in figures that emphasize clarity, balance, and compositional precision, producing a form that appears fully resolved and free from irregularity. And this condition reinforces the idea that the divine is defined by the degree to which the system is stabilized, rather than by the introduction of new forms. The figure of Athena occupies a uniquely stable position within the continuum between human and divine, as her body is not constructed through transformation, excess, or distortion, but through a condition of immediate completeness that aligns with the broader Greek conception of divinity as a state of resolved form, rather than an altered substance. And her mythological origin, emerging fully formed and armored from the head of Zeus, establishes a conceptual model in which the divine body is not subject to development or change, but exists as a fully articulated structure from the moment of its appearance, suggesting that the distinction between human and divine is not located in the process of becoming, but in the condition of being already complete. This immediate completeness is reflected in sculptural representations, where the body is constructed with a high degree of proportional precision, maintaining the same structural logic as the human figure, while eliminating the signs of instability, irregularity, and transition that characterize mortal embodiment. The Athena Parthenos, attributed to Phidias, provides a critical example of how this principle is materialized within a specific spatial and cultural context, as the figure is not presented as an isolated object, but as an integral component of the Parthenon, where architecture, sculpture, and ritual practice converge to produce a unified system of perception in which the body of the goddess operates as both a visual and conceptual center. The monumental scale of the statue, combined with the use of gold and ivory, amplifies the perception of stability and permanence. Yet these material qualities do not replace the underlying proportional system, but reinforce it, allowing the viewer to experience the coherence of the figure at an expanded scale. The body itself remains governed by the same relational logic that defines human representation, with balanced proportions, controlled distribution of weight, and a frontal orientation that emphasizes clarity and order, demonstrating that the divine is not constructed through deviation from the human form, but through the intensification of its internal structure. The integration of Athena's figure within the architectural space of the temple further reinforces the continuity between human and divine bodies by situating the figure within a system that organizes movement and perception, guiding the viewer's experience in a way that aligns with the principles of proportion and balance. The Parthenon itself operates according to a proportional system that echoes the structure of the body, with column spacing, entablature, and overall dimensions calibrated to produce a coherent visual experience, and the placement of the statue within this space ensures that the figure is encountered as part of a larger relational system rather than as an independent entity. The viewer's movement through the temple, the alignment of sight lines, and the controlled lighting conditions all contribute to the perception of the figure as stable and complete, reinforcing the idea that the divine body is not only constructed through internal relations, but through its integration within a broader spatial framework. The role of cult practice in shaping the perception of the divine body further complicates the relation between human and divine, as the statue of Athena was not merely an object of aesthetic contemplation, but a focal point of ritual activity, where offerings, processions, and ceremonies reinforce the presence of the goddess within the civic and religious life of the polis. The body of the goddess, while structurally consistent with human representation, acquires a different significance through its function within these practices, as it becomes a site where the divine is encountered and engaged, demonstrating that the distinction between human and divine is not only a matter of form, but of use and context. This aligns with the analysis of Jean-Pierre Vernant, who emphasizes that Greek gods are defined by their roles within a network of relations rather than by their physical characteristics, suggesting that the body operates as a medium through which these relations are made visible without requiring a departure from the human framework. The figure of Aphrodite introduces a different mode of divine presence within the same system, as her emergence from the sea presents a body that is immediately complete, yet operates according to a different perceptual logic, where continuity of surface and fluidity of form take precedence over the structural clarity that defines figures such as Athena, and this variation demonstrates that the system can accommodate different modes of organization without losing coherence. The Aphrodite of Knidos, attributed to Praxiteles, exemplifies this approach, as the figure is constructed through a continuous surface that integrates transitions between forms, producing a body that appears unified and self-contained, yet retains the proportional relations that ensure its stability. The absence of rigid segmentation does not result in a loss of structure, but in a different articulation of it, where coherence is achieved through continuity rather than through explicit division. The mythological narratives associated with Aphrodite further reinforce this mode of representation, as her influence operates through attraction and desire, forces that are not expressed through overt action, but through the presence of the body itself, suggesting that the divine can be articulated through different forms of engagement that do not require visible transformation. The body remains consistent with the human framework, yet its effect is different, demonstrating that the distinction between human and divines can be produced through the way the body is perceived, rather than through the way it is constructed. The figure of Hermes provides another variation within this system, as his role as a mediator between different domains is reflected in a body that appears relaxed and adaptable, capable of the movement without strain, yet still governed by the same proportional logic that ensures coherence. Sculptures such as Hermes, with the infant Dionysus, demonstrate how the body can be constructed to suggest fluidity and responsiveness while maintaining structural stability, producing a figure that embodies transition without losing balance. Hermes does not require a different body to signify his function, as the same system is sufficient to accommodate the variation, demonstrating the flexibility of the framework. The narratives surrounding Heracles further illustrate the continuity between human and divine bodies, as his transition from mortal to divine status occurs without a fundamental alteration of his physical form, indicating that the distinction between categories is not dependent on visual transformation, but on the recontextualization of the same structure. The labors of Heracles emphasize physical strength and endurance, qualities that are represented through the articulation of musculature within the proportional system, producing a body that appears capable of action while remaining coherent, and his eventual elevation to divine status does not require a change in this construction, but a shift in the way the body is understood, reinforcing the idea that the system operates across different conceptual levels. The philosophical implications of these variations can be further understood through the framework of Marcel Dayen, who emphasizes that Greek thought organizes difference through relational structures rather than through fixed categories, suggesting that the distinction between human and divine is maintained through a network of relations that define the position of each figure within the system, rather than through intrinsic differences in form. This perspective aligns with the visual system, where the body remains consistent while its meaning shifts according to context, demonstrating that representation operates through the regulation of relations rather than through the creation of separate forms. The integration of myth, sculpture, architecture, and ritual reveals that the body between human and divine is not a transitional state, but a structural condition that allows the same framework to sustain multiple levels of meaning, where the divine is not constructed as an alternative to the human, but as an extension of it, demonstrating that the system achieves complexity through refinement rather than multiplication, and that the distinction between categories is embedded within the same relational logic that governs all representation. The continuity between human and divine bodies in Greek art ultimately depends on a philosophical structure in which visible form operates as a mediator between perception and abstraction, allowing the body to function not as a fixed entity, but as a system through which different levels of reality can be articulated without requiring separation into distinct categories, and this structure can be understood through the philosophical framework associated with Plato, where visible forms are understood as participating in ideal structures that exist beyond them, suggesting that the divine body is not an independent invention, but a closer approximation to an ideal that remains abstract, and the sculptural representation of the divine therefore does not attempt to depict an entirely different being, but constructs a body that appears to approach this ideal through the refinement of proportion, balance, and coherence, producing a figure that remains within the bounds of human perception, while suggesting a level of completeness that exceeds ordinary experience. This Platonic framework does not imply that the divine body is a direct representation of an ideal form, but rather that it functions as a mediated approximation, where the system of relations that defines the body is resolved with greater precision, allowing the figure to appear more stable, more coherent, and less contingent. And this mediation is essential, as the ideal itself cannot be directly perceived, requiring a form that can be apprehended within the limits of human perception, and this necessity aligns with the narrative of Semele, where the unmediated presence of the divine cannot be sustained, reinforcing the idea that the body must remain within the same structural system in order to be visible at all. At the same time, the philosophical framework associated with Aristotle provides a complementary perspective, as the concept of potentiality and actuality allows the divine body to be understood as a form in which potential is fully realized, producing a condition in which the body appears complete and self-contained, not because it is static, but because its internal relations are fully actualized, creating a structure in which no further adjustment is required. And this condition distinguishes the divine from the human, where the human body is often represented as engaged in maintaining balance, adjusting to movement, or responding to external forces, while the divine body appears to possess equilibrium inherently, existing in a state where the system is fully resolved. The perceptual dimension of this distinction is critical, as the viewer does not encounter the divine body as an abstract concept, but as a visible form that must be interpreted through the same perceptual mechanisms used to understand the human body. And this process can be analyzed through the framework of Michael Baxendall, who emphasizes that visual representation is shaped by the interaction between the work and the viewer's interpretive habits, suggesting that the distinction between human and divine is not only constructed within the figure, but emerges through the viewer's recognition of the differences in refinement, stability, and coherence that define the figure's presence. The viewer perceives the same structural system but registers the degree to which it is resolved, allowing the divine body to be understood as operating at a different level within the same framework. The role of perception can be further clarified through the work of Rudolf Arnheim, whose analysis of visual balance demonstrates that the perception of stability depends on the resolution of opposing forces within a composition, suggesting that the divine body appears stable because the tensions that structure the human body are fully harmonized, producing a figure in which the distribution of weight, the alignment of axes, and the articulation of form create a condition of equilibrium that does not require adjustment, and this perceptual stability contributes to the sense of permanence that defines the divine, as the figure appears unaffected by the fluctuations that characterize human experience. The integration of these philosophical and perceptual frameworks reveals that the body between human and divine is not a transitional state, but a structural condition in which the same system is extended to operate across different levels of meaning, allowing the body to function as a medium through which the relation between the visible and the abstract can be articulated without requiring transformation into a different form, and this condition is reinforced by the consistency with which Greek art maintains the proportional system across both human and divine figures, demonstrating that coherence is achieved through the regulation of relations rather than through the multiplication of forms. The persistence of this system in later traditions, particularly in the Renaissance, where the study of classical sculpture informs the construction of idealized figures, indicates that the concept of the body as a bridge between human and divine remains influential, as artists continue to explore how proportion, balance, and coherence can be used to produce forms that suggest a level of perfection that exceeds ordinary experience, while remaining grounded in the human framework. And this continuity demonstrates that the classical system provides a model that is both stable and adaptable, capable of sustaining different interpretations while preserving its underlying logic. The narratives of Greek mythology, when considered in relation to this system, reinforce the idea that the distinction between human and divine is not located in the structure of the body, but in the way that structure is understood within a network of relations, where gods and mortals share the same visible form, but operate under different conditions. And this perspective aligns with the analysis of Jean-Pierre Vernant, who emphasizes that the gods are defined by their position within a relational system, rather than by intrinsic differences in form, suggesting that the body functions as a stable medium through which these relations are expressed without requiring alteration. The figure of Athena, when reconsidered within this framework, exemplifies the culmination of this system, as her body is constructed with a level of precision and stability that reflects her association with wisdom and order, yet remains fully consistent with the human form, demonstrating that the divine does not require a different body, but a different relation to the same body, and this relation is sustained through the integration of form, context, and perception, where the figure operates within a network of architectural, ritual, and cultural elements that reinforce its coherence. The body between human and divine therefore emerges as a condition in which the same structural system is extended to articulate different levels of meaning, demonstrating that the classical approach to representation achieves complexity not through the creation of separate forms, but through the refinement of relations within a unified framework, allowing the body to function as a bridge between perception and abstraction, and revealing that the distinction between human and divine is not a matter of visible difference, but of structural resolution, where the same form can operate across different conceptual domains without losing coherence, and where the divine is not constructed as an alternative to the human, but as its most resolved expression. The construction of space within the classical system depends not only on the arrangement of physical elements, but on the calibration of relations that determine how those elements are perceived over time, producing a condition in which space is not experienced as a static entity, but as a sequence of relations that unfold in relation to the position and movement of the viewer. And this temporal dimension is essential to understanding how order operates, as it reveals that coherence is not simply given in a single view, but is constructed through the progression of perception, where each step, each shift in angle, and each change in light contributes to the formation of a spatial experience that appears unified despite being encountered in fragments. The viewer does not apprehend the totality of space at once, but assembles it through movement, and the organization of the environment anticipates this process, structuring the sequence of perception in a way that ensures that each fragment aligns with the overall system, producing a continuity that is experienced rather than explicitly seen. This temporal structuring of space aligns with the analysis of Henri Bergson, whose concept of duration emphasizes that perception unfolds over time, rather than occurring as an instantaneous grasp of form, suggesting that the experience of architectural space depends on the integration of successive moments into a coherent whole, and the classical system can be understood as organizing these moments through the regulation of relations that remain consistent across different positions, ensuring that the viewer's movement through space does not disrupt coherence, but reinforces it. The repetition of elements, the alignment of axes, and the calibration of intervals create a framework in which each moment of perception corresponds to the others, allowing the viewer to construct a unified experience from a sequence of partial views. The alignment of space with the body further reinforces this temporal dimension, as the scale and proportion of architectural elements are calibrated to the range of human perception and movement, ensuring that the environment can be apprehended through the natural capacities of the viewer. The spacing between columns, the height of structures, and the dimensions of pathways are not arbitrary, but correspond to the scale of the body, creating a condition in which movement through space feels continuous and coherent, as each step reveals a relation that can be understood in terms of the previous one. This alignment ensures that the viewer remains oriented within the environment, as the proportional system provides a reference that stabilizes perception even as the viewpoint changes. The role of rhythm within this system further contributes to the experience of order, as the repetition of elements creates patterns that structure perception over time, allowing the viewer to anticipate the continuation of forms and to recognize the coherence of the system without needing to analyze its components explicitly. Columns, intervals, and structural elements function as units within a sequence that produces a visual rhythm, guiding the viewer's movement and attention. And this rhythm operates not as decoration, but as a fundamental aspect of the organization of space, ensuring that perception is aligned with the structure of the environment. The regularity of these patterns creates a sense of stability, while subtle variations prevent monotony, producing a balance that maintains engagement without disrupting coherence. The interaction between openness and enclosure introduces another layer of complexity to the construction of space, as the transition between interior and exterior environments is carefully regulated to produce a controlled experience in which the viewer moves between different spatial conditions without losing orientation. Open spaces allow for broader perception, where relations can be apprehended at a larger scale, while enclosed spaces focus attention and intensify the experience of proximity, creating a contrast that enhances the perception of both conditions. These transitions are not abrupt, but mediated through intermediate zones, such as colonnades and thresholds, which function as spaces of adjustment, allowing the viewer to recalibrate perception as they move between different environments. This mediation ensures that the continuity of the system is maintained even as the spatial conditions change. The threshold, in particular, plays a critical role in structuring the experience of space, as it marks the transition between different domains while maintaining the continuity of the system, allowing the viewer to pass from one condition to another without disruption. The threshold is not simply a boundary, but a zone of transformation, where the relations that define one space are gradually adjusted to align with those of another, ensuring that the transition is experienced as part of the overall system rather than as a break. This concept can be understood through the theoretical perspective of Martin Heidegger, whose analysis of dwelling emphasizes that space is defined by the relations that structure it, rather than by its physical boundaries, suggesting that thresholds function as points where these relations are reorganized, allowing the viewer to experience continuity across different spatial conditions. The organization of space also reflects broader cultural and social structures, as the arrangement of architectural elements can encode hierarchies and relationships that shape how space is used and understood. And this dimension can be examined through the work of Michel Foucault, who emphasizes that spatial organization can function as a means of structuring behavior and perception, suggesting that the order of space is not neutral, but participates in the regulation of experience. In the classical system, this regulation is achieved through proportional coherence rather than through overt control, as the arrangement of elements guides movement and attention in a way that appears natural while reinforcing the underlying structure. The integration of architectural space with the landscape further extends the system, as the positioning of structures within their environment ensures that the relations that define the building align with those of the surrounding space, creating a continuity that extends beyond the boundaries of the structure itself. The orientation of temples, the alignment with natural features, and the use of elevation and perspective ensure that the building is not isolated, but integrated into a larger spatial system, reinforcing the coherence of the environment as a whole. This integration demonstrates that the principles that govern architectural space are not confined to the building, but operate across different scales, connecting the organization of the body, the structure of the building, and the arrangement of the landscape into a unified system. The persistence of these principles in later architectural developments demonstrates their adaptability as the organization of space continues to be shaped by the regulation of relations that align perception with structure, and this continuity can be observed in the development of perspective in the Renaissance, where the work of Filippo Brunelleschi introduces a method for representing space that remains grounded in the principles of proportional coherence, allowing the viewer to perceive depth and relation within a structured framework. This development does not replace the classical system, but extends it into new domains, demonstrating that the organization of space remains central to the experience of architecture. The experience of space, therefore, emerges from a complex interaction between the body, perception, and the organization of relations that define the environment, producing a condition in which order is not imposed, but experienced as a natural quality of the space. And this experience depends on the precise calibration of elements that guide perception and movement, ensuring that the viewer remains oriented within the system. Space is not empty. Architecture is not merely physical, and order is not inherent, but constructed through the alignment of relations that integrate the body and the environment into a coherent whole, demonstrating that the stability of space is achieved through the same principles that govern the body, and that architecture functions as the medium through which these principles are extended and made visible. The experience of space cannot be separated from the movement through which it is encountered, and the classical system recognizes that perception is not static, but unfolds through the body as it shifts position, turns, advances, and pauses, producing a sequence of relations that are never given all at once, but must be assembled through time. And this unfolding is not incidental, but structured, as the organization of space anticipates the trajectory of the viewer and calibrates the arrangement of forms in a way that ensures continuity across changing viewpoints. The stability of space, therefore, does not reside in a fixed image, but in the consistency of relations that persist as perception moves, allowing the viewer to construct coherence from a succession of partial views, each of which aligns with the others through an underlying system that remains constant, even as appearances shift. The body becomes the medium through which space is synthesized, not merely observing, but actively producing the unity of the environment through its movement, and the organization of architecture reflects this condition by structuring space in a way that corresponds to the rhythm and scale of bodily experience. This relation between movement and perception can be further clarified through the work of James J. Gibson, whose theory of ecological perception emphasizes that the environment is not perceived as a collection of isolated objects, but as a field of affordances that are revealed through action, suggesting that space is understood through the possibilities it offers for movement and interaction, rather than through abstract representation. Within this framework, architectural space can be understood as organizing these affordances, guiding the viewer through a system in which paths, thresholds, and spatial transitions are structured to produce a coherent experience, ensuring that the environment is not encountered as fragmented, but as continuous. The classical system aligns with this understanding by constructing spaces that correspond to the natural capacities of the body, allowing movement to unfold in a way that reveals the underlying order of the environment without requiring explicit analysis. The sequencing of space is therefore central to its coherence, as the arrangement of elements creates a progression in which each position reveals a different aspect of the structure, while maintaining continuity with the others, producing a temporal experience that reinforces the stability of the system. The approach to a building, the passage along its perimeter, and the transition into its interior are not separate events, but stages within a continuous sequence, each of which is calibrated to guide perception and maintain orientation. The viewer does not encounter space as a single, unified image, but constructs it through this sequence, and the organization of architecture ensures that this construction remains coherent by aligning each stage with the underlying system of relations. The concept of the axis plays a critical role in this structuring of movement, as it establishes a direction that organizes the viewer's path and aligns perception along a central line, creating a sense of orientation that stabilizes experience even as the viewpoint changes. Axial alignment does not simply organize space visually, but directs movement, guiding the viewer toward focal points that anchor perception and reinforce the coherence of the environment. This directional structuring ensures that movement is not arbitrary, but oriented, producing a condition in which the viewer is guided through space in a way that reveals its organization, gradually and consistently. The experience of transition between spaces further demonstrates how movement is structured within the classical system, as the shift from one spatial condition to another is mediated through carefully calibrated intervals that allow perception to adjust without disruption. The passage from open to enclosed space, from light to shadow, or from exterior to interior, is not abrupt, but staged, creating a gradient that maintains continuity while introducing variation. These transitions function as moments of recalibration, allowing the viewer to adapt to new spatial conditions, while remaining oriented within the overall system, ensuring that the coherence of space is preserved across different environments. The threshold becomes a particularly significant element within this process, as it marks the point at which one spatial condition gives way to another while maintaining the continuity of the system, and its role extends beyond that of a boundary, to become a site where relations are reorganized, allowing the viewer to experience transformation without disorientation. The threshold does not interrupt space, but connects it, functioning as a zone in which the organization of relations is adjusted to align with the new condition, ensuring that movement remains continuous, even as the environment changes. This concept resonates with the phenomenological analysis of Martin Heidegger, who emphasizes that spaces are defined not by their limits, but by the relations that structure them, suggesting that thresholds operate as points where these relations are reconfigured rather than terminated. The role of anticipation within movement further contributes to the experience of order, as the repetition and rhythm of elements allow the viewer to predict the continuation of forms, creating a sense of stability that extends beyond the immediate view. Columns, intervals, and structural patterns establish expectations that guide perception, allowing the viewer to anticipate what lies ahead and to integrate successive views into a coherent whole. This anticipatory structure reinforces the sense of order by ensuring that each new perception aligns with what has already been experienced, producing continuity across time. The integration of light into this sequence enhances the structuring of movement, as variations in illumination create focal points and gradients that guide attention, reinforcing the organization of space through the modulation of visibility. Light marks transitions, highlights significant elements, and creates contrasts that define the boundaries between different spatial conditions, ensuring that the viewer's movement is directed not only through physical arrangements, but through perceptual cues. The interplay between light and shadow introduces a dynamic quality to space, allowing the structure of the environment to be revealed gradually as the viewer moves through it. The relationship between proximity and distance further shapes the experience of movement, as the arrangement of elements creates a hierarchy of spatial relations that guide perception from the immediate to the distant, allowing the viewer to navigate the environment through a series of layered experiences. Near elements provide detail and orientation, while distant elements establish overall structure, creating a balance that allows the viewer to maintain awareness of both local and global relations within the space. This layering ensures that movement through space remains coherent, as the viewer can integrate different levels of perception into a unified experience. The regulation of scale within this system ensures that the viewer remains oriented, as the dimensions of space correspond to the capacities of perception and movement, allowing the environment to be apprehended without becoming overwhelming or disjointed. Scale operates as a stabilizing factor, ensuring that the relations between elements remain comprehensible as the viewer moves through space, and this alignment between scale and perception reinforces the coherence of the system by maintaining a consistent framework within which variation can occur. The continuity of space across different environments further demonstrates how movement is structured within the classical system, as the integration of architecture with its surroundings ensures that transitions between built and natural environments are mediated in a way that preserves coherence. The positioning of structures within the landscape, the alignment with natural features, and the extension of architectural elements into the surrounding environment create a condition in which space is experienced as a continuous field, rather than as a series of disconnected zones. Movement through this field reveals the relations that connect different parts of the environment, reinforcing the sense of unity that defines the system. The experience of space, therefore, emerges from the interaction between movement and perception, where the organization of relations guides the viewer through a sequence of experiences that align with the structure of the environment, producing a condition in which order is not immediately visible, but becomes apparent through the continuity of perception across time. The body remains central to this process, as it provides the means through which space is synthesized, ensuring that the organization of the environment corresponds to the conditions of perception and movement. Space is not simply occupied, but enacted, as the viewer participates in its construction through movement, assembling a coherent experience from successive moments that are structured by the relations that define the environment. And this participatory dimension reinforces the idea that space is not given, but produced, not static but dynamic, not neutral but organized, revealing that the stability of space depends on the alignment between the organization of relations and the conditions of perception, and that architecture functions as the medium through which this alignment is achieved, transforming space into a system that guides movement, shapes perception, and produces the experience of order. If space is structured through relations that guide perception and movement, then the experience of order is never simply aesthetic, but also operative, shaping how the body behaves, where it pauses, how it advances, and what it attends to, producing a condition in which the organization of space participates in the regulation of experience without presenting itself as a system of control. And this subtle operation distinguishes the classical conception of order from more overt forms of spatial authority, as it embeds direction within coherence rather than imposing it through force. The viewer does not feel constrained by space, yet movement is guided, attention is directed, and perception is stabilized, suggesting that order functions most effectively when it becomes indistinguishable from the natural conditions of experience, allowing the structure of space to operate without resistance. This invisibility of order is not accidental, but constructed, as the alignment between the organization of space and the capacities of perception ensures that the system appears intuitive, masking the precision through which it is produced. The relation between space and control can be further understood through the theoretical framework associated with Michel Foucault, whose analysis of spatial organization emphasizes that environments can regulate behavior by structuring visibility, movement, and access, suggesting that the arrangement of space participates in the formation of experience by guiding how individuals interact with their surroundings. Within the classical system, this regulation does not manifest as overt surveillance or restriction, but operates through the coherence of relations that align perception with structure, producing a condition in which movement appears self-directed while remaining guided by the organization of the environment. The viewer is not compelled to move in a particular way, yet the structure of space encourages certain paths, emphasizes certain viewpoints, and minimizes others, creating a subtle form of direction that is integrated into the experience of order. This integration of control and coherence can be observed in the structuring of spatial hierarchies, where certain areas are emphasized through scale, alignment, and illumination, while others recede, producing a gradient of significance that guides attention and movement without requiring explicit instruction. The organization of these hierarchies ensures that the viewer's experience is oriented toward particular focal points, reinforcing the coherence of the system by aligning perception with the structure of the environment, the centrality of certain spaces, the framing of key elements, and the sequencing of transitions all contribute to this hierarchy, ensuring that the viewer encounters the environment in a way that reflects its organization. The invisibility of order depends on the consistency of relations across different scales, as the same principles that govern the arrangement of individual elements extend to the organization of the entire environment, producing a condition in which coherence is maintained regardless of the level at which the space is experienced. This scalability ensures that the viewer can move between different levels of perception without losing orientation, as the relations that define the space remain consistent, allowing the system to function as a unified whole. The alignment between local and global relations reinforces the stability of the environment, ensuring that each part contributes to the coherence of the whole. The perception of neutrality within space emerges from this consistency, as the alignment of relations produces a condition in which the organization of space appears natural and self-evident, obscuring the processes through which it is constructed. Space appears neutral, not because it lacks structure, but because its structure aligns so closely with the conditions of perception that it becomes invisible, allowing the viewer to experience the environment without recognizing the system that organizes it. This condition can be understood as a form of perceptual transparency, where the organization of relations is present, but not perceived as such, allowing space to function as a seamless field of experience. The concept of perceptual transparency can be further examined through the work of Ernst Gombrich, who emphasizes that visual systems rely on conventions that become naturalized through repeated exposure, suggesting that what appears self-evident is often the result of learned structures that shape perception. Within architectural space, these structures operate through the repetition and consistency of relations, allowing the viewer to internalize the organization of the environment and to perceive it as natural, reinforcing the invisibility of order. The classical system, through its emphasis on proportional coherence and balanced relations, produces a form of space that aligns with these perceptual conventions, ensuring that the organization of space remains unobtrusive. The relation between visibility and invisibility within this system further complicates the experience of space, as the elements that structure perception are not always those that attract attention, allowing the underlying organization to operate without becoming the focus of perception. Columns, alignments, and intervals function as structural components that guide perception, yet they often recede into the background, allowing the viewer to focus on other aspects of the environment while remaining oriented within the system. This separation between the visible and the operative ensures that order can function without being explicitly recognized, reinforcing its effectiveness. The extension of these principles into broader cultural contexts demonstrates that the organization of space reflects not only perceptual conditions, but also conceptual frameworks, as the emphasis on order and coherence within the classical system aligns with a broader concern with intelligibility and balance, suggesting that the structuring of space participates in the articulation of a worldview in which relations are regulated and harmony is maintained. Architecture becomes a medium through which this worldview is materialized, embedding conceptual structures within the organization of space and allowing them to be experienced directly. The continuity between the body, space, and order reaches its fullest articulation when the viewer recognizes that the same principles govern all levels of experience, producing a condition in which the organization of the body and the organization of the environment are not separate, but interconnected, forming a unified system that aligns perception with structure. The body does not merely inhabit space, but participates in its construction, as the relations that define the environment correspond to the capacities of perception, ensuring that the experience of space remains coherent and stable. This synthesis reveals that space is not an external condition, but an extension of the systems that define perception, demonstrating that the organization of the environment reflects the same principles that govern the body, and that architecture functions as the medium through which these principles are externalized, producing spaces that embody coherence through the regulation of relations. The stability of space is therefore not inherent but achieved, emerging from the alignment between the organization of form and the conditions of perception, ensuring that the experience of space remains consistent even as it unfolds through movement. The culmination of this system lies in the recognition that what appears neutral is in fact constructed, that what feels natural is produced through precise calibration, and that what seems stable is maintained through the continuous alignment of relations that guide perception and movement, revealing that space, architecture, and order are not separate domains but aspects of a unified system that operates through the regulation of relations, integrating the body and the environment into a coherent whole, and demonstrating that the experience of space is shaped not by what is immediately visible, but by the structures that remain unseen, guiding perception and movement in ways that define how the world is encountered. The relation between the viewer and the ideal is not established through direct access to a perfect form, but is constituted through a structured encounter in which perception is guided toward coherence, producing a condition in which what is seen appears complete, stable, and resolved, yet exceeds the singular instance of the object, creating a tension between the visible and the conceptual that defines the experience of the ideal. The viewer does not simply observe an image, but is positioned within a system that organizes perception in such a way that the form appears both fully present and indicative of a principle that extends beyond it, suggesting that the ideal is not an external standard imposed upon the object, but emerges through the regulation of relations that align perception with structure. The classical image, whether manifested in sculpture or spatial organization, does not present itself as an isolated entity, but as part of a system in which the viewer's perception is calibrated to recognize coherence, ensuring that the experience of the ideal arises through the interaction between the viewer and the structured form, rather than through the direct apprehension of an abstract perfection. This interaction can be understood through the philosophical framework associated with Plato, whose conception of ideal forms establishes a distinction between the visible and the intelligible, suggesting that the forms encountered in the material world participate in a higher order that cannot be fully realized within sensory experience. Within this framework, the classical image can be interpreted as an attempt to approximate such order through the precise organization of proportion, symmetry, and relational balance, producing a form that appears stable and complete, while simultaneously pointing beyond itself toward a principle that cannot be fully contained within it. The viewer, in encountering such a form, does not merely perceive its visible structure, but is directed toward an understanding of coherence that exceeds the immediate object, engaging with a system in which perception becomes a means of approaching the ideal without ever fully attaining it. The Aristotelian perspective complicates this relation by emphasizing that form is not separate from matter, but is realized within it, suggesting that the ideal is not located beyond the visible, but is actualized through the organization of the object itself. And within this framework, the classical image can be understood as embodying a condition in which potential has been fully realized, producing a form that appears complete and self-sufficient without requiring reference to an external standard. The viewer encounters not a representation of perfection, but a presence that is fully resolved. Yet the precision of its organization creates a distinction between this resolved condition and the variability of ordinary experience, producing a tension that shapes the perception of the ideal as both accessible and elevated. The object does not transcend the material world, but demonstrates the possibility of achieving coherence within it, suggesting that the ideal is not separate from reality, but a refinement of its structure. The experience of this refinement depends on the regulation of variation, as the classical system constructs forms that suppress irregularities without eliminating individuality, producing a condition in which the object appears universal rather than particular. And this universality is not achieved through abstraction, but through the precise calibration of relations that align the form with a broader system. The viewer, in encountering such a form, recognizes its coherence not as a property of the individual object, but as an expression of a system that extends beyond it, creating a condition in which perception becomes a process of aligning the visible with an internalized sense of order. This alignment can be further examined through the work of Ernst Gombrich, whose analysis of visual perception emphasizes that the recognition of coherence depends on the interaction between expectation and observation, suggesting that the viewer actively constructs the image through a process of adjustment that aligns what is seen with what is anticipated. The classical system, through its emphasis on proportional consistency and balance relations, establishes a framework within which these expectations can be formed, ensuring that the viewer experiences the image as coherent and complete. The role of the viewer within this system is not passive, but participatory, as perception involves the active integration of visual information into a structured whole, producing a condition in which the coherence of the image depends on the alignment between the organization of the object and the perceptual processes of the viewer. This participatory dimension can be further understood through the theoretical framework of Immanuel Kant, whose analysis of aesthetic judgment emphasizes that the experience of beauty arises from the harmonious interplay between imagination and understanding, suggesting that the perception of coherence depends on the alignment between sensory input and cognitive structure. Within this framework, the classical image can be understood as facilitating this alignment by organizing its elements in a way that allows the viewer to experience a sense of unity without requiring conceptual resolution, producing a condition in which the perception of the ideal is grounded in the structure of experience, rather than in the recognition of an external standard. The positioning of the viewer in relation to the image further reinforces this alignment, as the organization of the form anticipates a particular viewpoint, structuring the conditions under which it is perceived and ensuring that its coherence is most fully realized when encountered from specific positions. And this structuring does not impose a single perspective, but creates a range of positions within which the relations that define the form remain consistent, allowing the viewer to move while maintaining the perception of stability. The viewer's movement becomes part of the system, as the shifting viewpoints reveal different aspects of the structure while preserving its coherence, demonstrating that the ideal is not fixed in a single image, but sustained across multiple perceptions that are integrated into a unified experience. The integration of the viewer into the system of the image can be further clarified through the concept of the period eye developed by Michael Baxendall, which emphasizes that perception is shaped by cultural frameworks that determine how forms are interpreted, suggesting that the recognition of the ideal depends on the alignment between the structure of the image and the perceptual habits of the viewer. Within the classical system, these habits are cultivated through the repetition of proportional and relational patterns, ensuring that the viewer develops an internalized sense of order that allows the coherence of the image to be recognized without conscious analysis. The ideal, in this sense, is not an external standard, but a condition that is internalized through the process of perception, allowing the viewer to engage with the image in a way that reinforces its coherence. The extension of this relation into spatial experience further complicates the role of the viewer, as the organization of architectural space positions the viewer within a system that extends beyond individual objects, creating an environment in which the principles that govern the image are applied to the organization of space, guiding movement and perception in a way that aligns with the underlying structure. The viewer does not encounter isolated forms, but a continuous field in which each element contributes to the coherence of the whole, reinforcing the experience of the ideal as a condition that permeates the environment. This extension demonstrates that the ideal is not confined to the representation of the body, but operates across different scales, shaping the experience of both objects and spaces. The phenomenological perspective associated with Maurice Merleau-Ponty provides further insight into this integration, as it emphasizes that perception is embodied, and that the experience of space depends on the interaction between the body and the environment, suggesting that the ideal is not an abstract concept, but a condition that emerges through the alignment between perception and structure. The classical system, by organizing both objects and spaces according to the same principles, ensures that this alignment is maintained, allowing the viewer to experience coherence across different contexts, reinforcing the unity of the system. The relation between the viewer and the ideal thus reveals that perception is structured, not neutral, and that the experience of coherence depends on the alignment between the organization of the object and the perceptual processes of the viewer, producing a condition in which the ideal is not directly visible, but emerges through the interaction between the two, shaping how forms are seen and understood. The viewer is not external to the system, but integrated into it, participating in the construction of the image through perception, and this participation ensures that the ideal remains a dynamic condition that is continually realized through the act of viewing. The culmination of this relation lies in the recognition that the ideal is not a fixed entity, but a relational condition that emerges through the alignment between perception and structure, demonstrating that the experience of coherence depends on the integration of the viewer into the system of the image, and that the classical system achieves this integration through the precise organization of relations that guide perception and movement, producing a condition in which the viewer encounters not merely a representation, but a structured experience that aligns the visible with the intelligible, revealing that the ideal is not located beyond the image, but emerges through the interaction between the viewer and the form, shaping perception in a way that reflects the underlying principles of order and coherence that define the system. The appearance of perfection within the classical system is not achieved through the elimination of irregularity, but through the precise regulation of variation, producing a condition in which forms appear stable, coherent, and resolved, while containing within them subtle deviations that sustain their perceptual effectiveness. And this concealed presence of imperfection reveals that the ideal is not an absolute state, but a constructed effect that depends on the alignment between structure and perception. The viewer encounters a form that appears complete and self-sufficient, yet this completeness is not the result of strict adherence to geometric regularity, but of calibrated adjustments that compensate for the conditions under which the form is seen, ensuring that it maintains coherence across different viewpoints. The classical system does not pursue perfection as a fixed abstraction, but produces it as an experience, emerging through the interaction between the organization of the object and the perceptual processes of the viewer, demonstrating that what appears stable and natural is the result of a dynamic equilibrium rather than a static condition. This dynamic equilibrium can be examined through the distinction between mathematical precision and perceptual coherence, where a form that adheres strictly to geometric regularity may fail to appear stable when experienced within the constraints of human perception, requiring adjustments that align the structure with the way it is seen rather than with abstract measurement. And this principle is exemplified in the refinements of classical architecture, where curvature and variation are introduced to correct optical distortions, ensuring that the structure appears straight and balanced, despite deviations from strict geometry. The presence of entasis in columns, the curvature of horizontal lines, and the modulation of spacing demonstrate that the ideal is not achieved through rigid uniformity, but through responsiveness to perceptual conditions, revealing that perfection is constructed through the integration of controlled irregularities that remain subordinate to the overall system. These refinements do not disrupt the coherence of the structure, but enhance it, demonstrating that the appearance of stability depends on deviations that are precisely calibrated to maintain balance. The integration of imperfection within the classical body operates according to the same principle, as the representation of the figure incorporates slight asymmetries and variations that prevent it from appearing rigid or artificial, while preserving the overall coherence of the system, producing a form that appears both stable and alive. The classical figure does not conform to perfect bilateral symmetry, but introduces shifts in weight, proportion, and alignment that create a dynamic equilibrium, allowing the body to sustain a sense of movement within stability. And this balance reflects an understanding that the perception of vitality depends on variation that is regulated, rather than eliminated. The viewer perceives the figure as ideal, not because it is perfectly symmetrical, but because its variations are integrated into a system that maintains coherence, demonstrating that the ideal is not the absence of difference, but the organization of difference within a structured framework. This relational understanding of perfection can be further clarified through the work of Ernst Gombrich, whose analysis of visual perception emphasizes that the recognition of order depends on the reconciliation of variation within a coherent structure, suggesting that perception operates through a process of adjustment in which the viewer aligns what is seen with internalized expectations of coherence. Within this framework, the classical system constructs forms that guide this process, ensuring that variations are perceived as components of a unified whole rather than as disruptions, allowing the viewer to experience stability despite the presence of irregularities. The deviations within the form are not perceived as flaws but as elements that contribute to the overall balance, demonstrating that the distinction between perfection and imperfection is not absolute but dependent on the organization of relations. The philosophical implications of this integration can be explored through the Aristotelian conception of form as the realization of potential within matter, suggesting that the appearance of completeness depends on the successful organization of variation into a coherent structure, allowing the form to appear resolved even as it accommodates differences. The classical image does not eliminate imperfection, but incorporates it into a system that ensures that it does not disrupt the overall coherence, producing a condition in which the form appears complete, while remaining responsive to the conditions of perception. This responsiveness reflects a broader understanding of the relation between structure and experience, where the effectiveness of the system depends on its ability to align with the way forms are encountered, rather than with abstract principles that do not account for perceptual conditions. The role of perception in this process can be further examined through the phenomenological framework of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose emphasis on embodied perception suggests that the experience of form depends on the interaction between the body and the environment, indicating that the stability of an object is not inherent, but emerges through its relation to the perceiving subject. Within this framework, the adjustments that produce the appearance of perfection can be understood as responses to the conditions under which the object is perceived, ensuring that the relations that define the form remain consistent across different positions and movements. The viewer does not perceive the underlying irregularities, but experiences the result of their integration, demonstrating that the effectiveness of the system depends on its ability to operate below the threshold of conscious recognition. The concealment of imperfection within the classical system also reflects a broader epistemological condition in which the processes that produce coherence remain hidden from direct perception, allowing the form to appear natural and self-evident, while obscuring the complexity of its construction. And this condition can be examined through the perspective of Immanuel Kant, whose analysis of aesthetic judgment emphasizes that the experience of beauty arises from the harmonious interaction between cognitive faculties, producing a sense of unity that does not require explicit understanding of the underlying structure. The classical form facilitates this experience by organizing its elements in a way that aligns with the viewer's perceptual and cognitive capacities, allowing coherence to be experienced without being analyzed, reinforcing the invisibility of the processes that produce it. The temporal dimension of perception further complicates the relation between perfection and imperfection, as the viewer's movement around the object or through space reveals different aspects of the form, each of which must align with the overall structure to maintain coherence, producing a condition in which the stability of the form depends on its ability to sustain consistency across successive moments of perception. The viewer constructs the experience of perfection through the integration of these moments, demonstrating that the ideal is not a static condition, but a dynamic process that unfolds over time. And this process depends on the ability of the system to accommodate variation without disrupting coherence, ensuring that each new perception aligns with the previous ones to produce a unified experience. The extension of this principle into architectural space further demonstrates how imperfection operates within the classical system, as the adjustments made to structures ensure that they appear stable and coherent when experienced from different viewpoints, reinforcing the alignment between the organization of space and the conditions of perception. The viewer does not perceive these adjustments as deviations, but experiences the space as ordered and balanced, demonstrating that the effectiveness of the system depends on its ability to integrate variation in a way that remains invisible. The presence of curvature, variation in spacing, and modulation of form ensures that the structure aligns with perceptual conditions, producing a space that appears stable despite the complexity of its construction. The relation between imperfection and perfection thus reveals that the classical system does not seek to eliminate irregularity, but to regulate it, producing a condition in which variation is subordinated to coherence, allowing the form to appear stable while accommodating the realities of perception and experience. The viewer encounters not an absolute perfection, but a constructed condition that depends on the integration of differences, demonstrating that the ideal is not a fixed standard, but a relational effect that emerges through the organization of form. The culmination of this process lies in the recognition that perfection is not a property of the object, but an experience produced through the alignment between the structure of the form and the conditions of perception, revealing that what appears complete and stable is the result of precise calibration rather than inherent perfection, and that the presence of imperfection within the system is not a flaw, but a necessary component that allows the form to function as intended, ensuring that coherence is maintained across different conditions, and that the viewer's experience remains consistent. The classical system achieves perfection not by eliminating imperfection, but by incorporating it into a structure that regulates variation, producing a condition in which the ideal is realized through the careful balance of differences, demonstrating that the appearance of perfection depends on the presence of imperfection that remains concealed within the overall organization of the form. The persistence of Greek art across time does not unfold as a passive inheritance of forms, but as an active reconfiguration of a system that continues to shape how images, bodies, and spaces are constructed and perceived, allowing the classical ideal to remain operative within contexts that differ fundamentally from those in which it first emerged. What is transmitted is not a fixed visual language, but a structure of relations that can be reactivated, reinterpreted, and transformed, producing a condition in which the coherence associated with Greek art appears repeatedly in different historical moments, without requiring direct continuity of form. The viewer does not encounter Greek art solely through original objects, but through a network of rearticulations that sustain its principles, demonstrating that the afterlife of the classical system depends on its capacity to function as a framework for perception rather than as a collection of images. This framework persists because it aligns with fundamental conditions of visual organization, allowing it to be recognized and reconstructed even when its original context is no longer present. The Roman engagement with Greek art provides an early instance of this reconfiguration, as Greek forms are absorbed into a system that emphasizes political authority, historical continuity, and imperial presence, transforming the conditions under which the classical ideal is perceived while preserving its structural coherence. Roman copies of Greek sculptures do not simply reproduce lost originals, but translate them into a new context in which the emphasis shifts from the articulation of idealized bodies to the assertion of identity and power, producing a hybrid condition in which the classical system operates within a different framework of meaning. The viewer encounters forms that retain proportional balance and compositional clarity while functioning within a system that reorients their significance, demonstrating that the afterlife of Greek art involves not only preservation but transformation, as the same relational structure is adapted to new purposes. This process reveals that the classical system is not bound to a single interpretation, but capable of sustaining multiple layers of meaning, allowing it to remain relevant across different contexts. The theoretical reconstruction of Greek art in the 18th century introduces a further dimension to its afterlife, as the writings of Johann Joachim Winckelmann establish a model of classical beauty that redefines Greek art as an ideal standard, emphasizing qualities such as clarity, restraint, and balanced proportion. And this reconstruction does not simply describe historical objects, but creates a conceptual framework through which they are interpreted, transforming the perception of Greek art into a normative system that shapes artistic practice and aesthetic judgment. Winckelmann's emphasis on noble simplicity and quiet grandeur repositions Greek art as a paradigm of perfection, influencing how later artists and viewers understand the relation between form and ideality. And this reinterpretation demonstrates that the afterlife of Greek art depends not only on the survival of objects, but on the conceptual frameworks through which they are perceived, suggesting that its persistence is mediated by theory as much as by material continuity. The Renaissance engagement with Greek art extends this process by reactivating the proportional and spatial systems that define the classical ideal, producing a condition in which the principles of Greek art are not merely imitated, but analyzed and reconstructed through a synthesis of artistic practice and intellectual inquiry. Figures such as Leon Battista Alberti articulate a theory of proportion that aligns architectural and artistic production with mathematical relations, establishing a framework in which the coherence of form is grounded in numerical harmony, while Leonardo da Vinci investigates the structure of the human body through geometry, demonstrating that the organization of the figure can be understood as a system of relations that reflects a broader order. The Renaissance does not simply revive Greek art, but transforms it into a method for constructing forms that align with both perceptual and intellectual conditions, ensuring that the classical system remains active within a new context that integrates scientific, philosophical, and artistic concerns. The persistence of Greek art can also be understood through the concept of cultural memory, as the transmission of forms and ideas across time involves processes of reinterpretation that allow them to remain relevant within changing contexts. And this process is central to the analysis developed by A.B. Warburg, whose work emphasizes that images carry with them latent energies that can be reactivated in different historical moments, suggesting that the afterlife of Greek art involves not only the preservation of visual forms, but the transmission of expressive and conceptual structures that shape how images are perceived. Warburg's notion of the survival of antiquity reveals that the classical system persists not as a static inheritance, but as a dynamic force that continues to influence visual culture, allowing elements of Greek art to reappear in new configurations that reflect contemporary concerns while maintaining continuity with the past. The interpretive framework developed by Erwin Panofsky further clarifies how the afterlife of Greek art operates at the level of meaning, as his analysis of iconology demonstrates that visual forms carry layers of significance that extend beyond their immediate appearance, suggesting that the classical system functions not only as a formal structure, but as a bearer of symbolic content that can be reinterpreted across different contexts. Panofsky's emphasis on the relation between form and meaning reveals that the persistence of Greek art involves the transmission of both visual and conceptual elements, allowing the classical ideal to be rearticulated in ways that reflect new intellectual frameworks, while maintaining its structural coherence. The reinterpretation of Greek art in the neoclassical period further demonstrates the adaptability of the classical system, as artists engage with its principles in response to changing political and cultural conditions, producing works that reflect both a return to classical ideals and a transformation of their meaning. The emphasis on clarity, proportion, and restraint aligns with the desire to establish a universal standard for art, suggesting that the classical system continues to function as a model for coherence, even as its historical context changes, and this re-engagement reveals that the afterlife of Greek art is sustained through its ability to be reinterpreted in ways that align with contemporary concerns, ensuring that its principles remain relevant. The critical engagement with Greek art in modernity introduces a further layer of complexity, as artists and theorists both draw upon and challenge the classical system, exploring its limitations while retaining its emphasis on relational coherence. And this tension can be examined through the perspective of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose analysis of Greek culture distinguishes between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, suggesting that the classical ideal represents a balance between order and excess that is continually renegotiated within artistic practice. The modern reinterpretation of Greek art does not abandon its principles, but subjects them to critique, revealing that the afterlife of the classical system involves both preservation and transformation, as its coherence is re-examined in light of new conditions. The viewer remains central to this process, as the perception of Greek art and its later reinterpretations depends on the alignment between the organization of the object and the perceptual frameworks through which it is understood, ensuring that the classical system continues to function as a structure that shapes visual experience. The recognition of proportion, balance, and relational coherence allows the viewer to engage with forms across different periods, demonstrating that the afterlife of Greek art is sustained not only through the transmission of forms, but through the continuity of perception that allows its principles to remain intelligible. The persistence of Greek art reveals that its influence is not confined to the past, but extends into the present, as a system that continues to shape how images and spaces are constructed and experienced, demonstrating that the classical ideal is not a static reference, but an active condition that reappears wherever relations are organized toward coherence. The forms that emerge in different periods do not replicate Greek art, but engage with its underlying structure, ensuring that its principles remain operative even as its manifestations change, allowing the afterlife of Greek art to be understood not as continuity alone, but as a process of transformation that sustains its relevance across time. The ideal does not disappear when the image ends, nor does it remain confined to the objects in which it first appears, but persists as a condition that continues to shape how forms are perceived, constructed, and understood, revealing that what has been encountered is not a historical phenomenon that can be left behind, but a system that remains active within perception itself. The viewer, having moved through bodies, spaces, and structures organized according to the principles of proportion, balance, and coherence, does not simply retain knowledge of these forms, but carries with them a transformed mode of seeing in which relations are no longer experienced as arbitrary, but as structured, suggesting that the ideal is not located in the past, but continues to operate wherever perception aligns with order. The forms that have been encountered do not conclude their presence when the viewing ends, as their underlying system persists, shaping the conditions under which new images and spaces are interpreted, ensuring that the experience of the classical remains embedded within the act of perception. The body, which first appeared as a site of measurement and proportion, extends beyond its representation to become the basis through which space and form are understood, revealing that the organization of the figure is not isolated but foundational, providing the framework through which relations can be apprehended across different scales. The viewer recognizes that the structure of the body is not merely an object of observation, but a system that informs the perception of space, allowing architecture and environment to be understood as extensions of the same logic, producing a continuity that integrates the internal and the external into a unified field. This continuity demonstrates that the ideal is not a singular form, but a relational condition that emerges wherever coherence is achieved through the alignment of parts within a whole, suggesting that the principles that govern the body remain operative in the organization of space and the construction of images. The experience of space, which unfolded as a structured field rather than an empty expanse, reveals that movement and perception are guided by relations that remain largely unseen, demonstrating that order operates not as an explicit directive, but as a condition that shapes experience from within, allowing the viewer to navigate environments that appear neutral while being carefully organized. The realization that space is constructed rather than given transforms the perception of the environment, revealing that the stability that appears natural is the result of calibration, and that the coherence of space depends on the alignment between structure and perception. This recognition extends beyond architecture to encompass all forms of visual organization, suggesting that the principles that govern space are present wherever relations are arranged to produce continuity and balance. The viewer's position within this system becomes increasingly evident as the act of seeing is no longer understood as passive reception, but as participation in a structure that aligns perception with form, demonstrating that the ideal is not encountered externally, but emerges through the interaction between the viewer and the object. The alignment between expectation and observation, between movement and structure, produces a condition in which coherence is experienced rather than imposed, revealing that the ideal is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process that unfolds through perception. The viewer does not simply recognize the ideal, but contributes to its realization, as the act of seeing integrates successive moments into a unified experience that reflects the underlying organization of the form. The presence of imperfection within this system further clarifies that the ideal is not an absolute state, but a constructed condition that depends on the regulation of variation, allowing forms to maintain coherence while adapting to the realities of perception and experience. The adjustments that remain hidden within structures ensure that stability is sustained across changing viewpoints, demonstrating that what appears perfect is the result of careful calibration rather than inherent perfection. This understanding dissolves the distinction between perfection and imperfection as opposing categories, revealing that the ideal depends on the integration of differences within a coherent system, allowing variation to contribute to stability rather than disrupt it. The persistence of these principles across time reveals that the ideal does not belong to a specific historical moment, but continues to shape how forms are constructed and perceived, demonstrating that the afterlife of Greek art is not confined to the survival of objects, but extends to the continuity of the system that organizes perception. The viewer encounters traces of this system in later works, not as direct repetitions, but as reconfigurations that maintain the underlying logic, ensuring that the classical remains present, even as its manifestations change. This persistence suggests that the ideal is not something that can be lost, but something that reappears wherever relations are organized toward coherence, revealing that its presence is not dependent on historical continuity, but on the conditions of perception itself. The recognition that the ideal persists within perception transforms the understanding of visual experience, revealing that what appears natural is often constructed, and that the coherence that defines the image or the space is the result of relations that have been carefully arranged to produce stability. The viewer, having encountered the system through which this stability is achieved, no longer perceives forms as isolated, but as components within a broader structure that governs how they are seen and understood, demonstrating that the ideal is not located within individual objects, but within the relations that connect them. This shift in perception allows the viewer to recognize the presence of order in contexts that extend beyond the classical, revealing that the principles that have been encountered continue to operate in new forms and environments. The ideal, therefore, does not remain as a distant concept or a historical reference, but persists as an active condition that shapes perception across different contexts, ensuring that the experience of coherence continues to inform how forms are constructed and understood. The viewer does not leave the system behind, but carries it forward, as the alignment between perception and structure becomes a framework through which new experiences are interpreted, demonstrating that the ideal is not something that can be fully grasped or contained, but something that continues to unfold through the act of seeing. The presence of the ideal is not confined to the objects that first revealed it, but extends into the conditions of perception itself, ensuring that it remains active wherever relations are organized to produce coherence. What remains is not an image, a structure, or a historical period, but a way of seeing that recognizes the constructed nature of order and the persistence of the systems that produce it, allowing the viewer to encounter the world as a field of relations that can be understood through the principles that have been revealed. The ideal does not disappear, because it was never located solely within the objects that represented it, but exists as a condition that continues to shape perception, ensuring that it remains present wherever forms are organized toward coherence, revealing that what has been encountered is not something that can be left behind, but something that continues to operate within the experience of seeing, shaping how the world is perceived long after the image has ended. Thank you for spending this quiet time here. The museum is beginning to open again, and the stillness slowly gives way to the presence of others. What felt suspended now returns to movement, but perhaps not entirely the same. If this space helps you focus, reflect, or see these works differently, you can return to it whenever you need a quieter place to think. And if there are particular artists, ideas, or periods you would like to explore next, feel free to share them.